Spain has had enough. After watching from the sidelines while the West armed Ukraine, Spain has finally decided to take action, and it's sending a brutal message to Russian President Vladimir Putin: get out of Ukraine. This isn't just a routine arms delivery. Spain's new aid package is packed with weapons designed to crush Russian forces and push them back once and for all. The Kremlin is reeling, and Putin's plans are in serious danger. Spain's move could be the tipping point that turns the tide of the war, pushing Putin's invasion to the brink of collapse. In this video, we reveal what Spain is sending and how it's going to help Ukraine deliver a crushing blow to Putin's ambitions. Let's get into it. On March 24, 2024, the Defense Post reported on Spain's announcement that it intended to send 19 of its Leopard 2A4 tanks to Ukraine by September of the same year. The tanks wouldn't simply be pulled out of storage and shipped over. Instead, Spain said it would contact General Dynamics European Land Systems to complete full commissioning services on every tank, giving each Leopard a full overhaul while replacing any defective parts to ensure each tank's systems were fully operational by the time they reached Ukraine. The delivery would be the second Spain would send to Ukraine. The first came in 2023, with Spain donating 6 of its Leopard tanks. With this second batch, Spain would more than quadruple its tank support for Ukraine. Still, as impressive as this announcement was, it represented a fairly small amount of aid being delivered to Ukraine. Almost 20 Leopard 2A4 tanks would certainly be useful from a defensive standpoint, but they wouldn't be enough to help Ukraine turn the tide against the Russian forces that were making a heavy push in Donetsk. But more was to come. 2 months later, on May 27th, Spain decided to double down on this initial show of support. The country's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez sat down with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to sign an agreement that would see Spain deliver an impressive €1 billion in aid, roughly translated into $1.08 billion, as part of a pact that sees Spain ally itself with Ukraine for the next decade. "It's more important than ever to redouble our support," claimed Sanchez in a press conference following the signing. According to the agreement in question, Spain claims it will provide modern military equipment for ground, sea, aerial, and other uses based on Ukraine's key capacity needs at the time. Interestingly, Spain has also agreed to help Ukraine protect its maritime food export routes, ensuring the country can continue to be the breadbasket of Europe without fear of Russian interference preventing it from shipping through the Black Sea. The question from there was, where would the $1.08 billion be spent? Newsweek offered some answers in a May 27th article, in which it detailed the various weapon systems Spain had committed to delivering. The 19 Leopard tanks pledged to Ukraine back in March were part of that list, as were a dozen of the powerful Patriot anti-aircraft missile systems that Ukraine has been using so well to keep Russia's aerial bombardments at bay. Add ammunition and anti-drone gear to the package, and you have a donation that covers most of the key areas of the war. But Newsweek also delivered a detail that wasn't in the initial Reuters report. Spain had committed to sending a staggering $5.4 billion by the end of 2027, meaning the $1.08 billion in equipment being donated from May 24 would simply be the first in multiple rounds of donations, designed to help Ukraine defend itself and ultimately recover from its war effort. The question now is simple: why would Spain commit to such an extensive aid package? After all, its history with Russia isn't quite as fraught as that of many other European countries that fear Russian aggression. Spain was never part of the Soviet yoke following World War II, as countries like Poland and the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, all three being ardent supporters of Ukraine, were. If anything, you could argue that Spain's recent history with Russia has been as close to neutral as it could be, considering Russia's actions in the 20th century through to today in Ukraine. Granted, Moscow played a role in the Spanish Civil War. The Soviet Union offered active support to Spain's Republican factions at the time, sending military advisors, weapons, and volunteer soldiers in exchange for gold drawn out of the Bank of Spain's reserves. However, Spain would eventually come to laud those Soviet volunteers. A monument to them was erected in Madrid in 1989, listing the names of 182 Russian combatants killed during the Civil War. There was just one problem. The Republicans lost the Spanish Civil War to the Nationalists in 1939, meaning all of the Soviet support was for naught. Now under Franco, Spain became an enemy to Russia, with Spain's Blue Division of volunteers fighting against the Soviet Red Army on the Eastern Front for a short period until Franco decided enough was enough. He withdrew the Spanish soldiers, with Spain going on to remain neutral for the rest of World War II. So conflict existed, but Spain and the Soviet Union tended to essentially stay away from one another following World War II. There were signs of tension, such as Nikita Khrushchev claiming that Russia's relationship with Spain was the worst but hardly the most problematic. when speaking in front of the United Nations General Assembly in October 1960, which followed Franco banning a soccer match between Spain and the Soviet Union earlier in the year. But direct conflict between the two was never really an issue. And toward the end of Franco's reign, the relationship between the two countries was even starting to defrost. A trade agreement was signed in 1972, with the Soviet ambassador being appointed to Spain around 5 years later. As the Soviet Union gave way to the Russian Federation in the early 1990s, Spain and Russia continued to have a cordial relationship. Former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev and Spain's King Juan Carlos I even worked together on issues such as Kosovo, declaring its independence from Serbia. Putin would even visit Spain multiple times in the 2000s. There were a few hiccups along the way, of course, but as recently as 2020, a Russian representative was writing in the margins of the Gaidar Forum that he believed, "There is no reason for our nations to be guided by the politics of others, and we trust that Russian-Spanish relations, with the current government or with any other, have a good future." Then came February 2022, and a true test of that statement. Russia invaded Ukraine, putting all of Europe on notice. Putin was no longer interested in playing politics or being diplomatic. He was going to take what he wanted by force. And like most other European countries, Spain took this action as a direct threat, which has resulted in any true diplomatic ties between Russia and Spain going up in smoke. If you need any evidence of that, you only need to refer to the comments made by Spain's defense minister, Margarita Robles, in March 2024, the same month in which Spain committed its 19 Leopard tanks. Speaking to the Spanish newspaper La Vanguardia, Robles said the situation with Russia was extremely complex, while making sure to point out something that is likely on every Spanish mind: right now, a ballistic missile could easily reach Spain from Russia. She continued, calling the threat that Russia poses to the countries that neighbor Ukraine total and absolute. Many of those countries, such as the Baltic states we mentioned earlier, are also NATO members, as is Spain. Reading between the lines of this comment, Robles is clearly stating that any threat to these NATO member countries is also a threat to Spain, not least because Article 5 of the NATO Charter provides that all members of the alliance would come to the aid of any other member state should one be subject to an armed attack. If Putin's ambitions spread to the likes of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, for instance, any invasion he launched into those countries would leave Spain duty-bound to come to their defense. Robles made this even clearer when she said, "You only have to listen to the latest statement from Putin in which he talks about the possibility of nuclear attacks." She points out that the countries close to Russia are already well aware of the danger Putin poses, while those further to the west don't have the awareness that perhaps they need. She went on to call Putin an unscrupulous person. So the reasoning behind Spain delivering such a historic blow to Russia becomes clear. Spain feels threatened. Putin's actions in Ukraine have shown that he's a leader who will not stop in his quest to get what he wants. So rather than leave Ukraine to fend for itself, Spain is making its military donations to bolster Ukraine's defenses to the point where it can stop Putin in his tracks before he turns his attention to the rest of Europe. But let's come back to Spain's military aid to Ukraine. Just how much had it delivered before the announcement of this historic package? As it turns out, not that much. According to Statista, Spain had sent $1.35 billion in aid between February 2022 and June 2024, a figure that includes the $1.08 billion announced in May 2024. So prior to this announcement, Spain had only provided around $280 million, with much of that coming in the form of direct financial aid, barring the 2023 delivery of a handful of Leopard tanks. This lack of aid puts Spain fairly low on the list of countries that have donated to Ukraine. It ranks 17th on the list, well behind other major European powers such as Germany and the United Kingdom, which have both cracked or come close to cracking the $15 billion mark. Granted, Spain is a member of the European Union or EU, and various EU institutions have donated $43.67 billion since the war began. Spain could argue that it will have donated via those institutions, but the fact remains that up until 2024, it had been one of the few major powers not to make an extensive commitment to Ukraine. To expand on that point, we can also look to Statista to explain how much Spain has donated as a share of the country's gross domestic product, or GDP. Then it's even lower on the list, coming in at 27 out of the 38 nations that have donated to Ukraine. Spain has spent just 0.09% of its GDP on providing military aid to Ukraine, meaning one of Europe's richest nations has also been one of the continent's stingiest when it comes to providing aid. For context, the UK has committed 0.45% of its GDP since the Ukraine war began, while the countries that are most under threat should Putin win, contributing considerably more. Estonia's donations, when stacked up against its GDP, come to 1.66%, for instance, with Lithuania landing on 1.43% and Latvia on 1.35%. That information offers much-needed context as to why Spain's most recent donation announcements are such a devastating blow for Putin. For almost the entire Ukraine war, he had been able to rely on Spain to be cautious at best when it came to supporting Ukraine. The country outwardly backed Zelensky, but wasn't following up its verbal support with substantial amounts of money. That's all changed. Over $1 billion worth of equipment will be flowing from Spain and into Ukraine in 2024, with the promise of over $4 billion more to come by 2027. With that, let's move on to an examination of the specific equipment that Spain is sending. We'll start with the Leopard 2A4 tank. The tank is the most common model of the Leopard 2, with its history dating back to West Germany in 1977. It was during that year, at the height of the Cold War, that West German contractor Krauss Maffei Wegmann worked alongside Rheinmetall to fulfill its promise to deliver a successor to the famous Leopard battle tank. A staggering 1,800 of the first Leopard 2 tanks were built in the late 1970s, with the design undergoing several upgrades in the years that followed. The Leopard 2A1 brought with it some minor modifications, including the addition of new ammo racks and a thermal sight for the tank's gunners. As for the 2A2, it upgraded the thermal sight, added a deflector plate for the tank's periscope, and bolstered the Leopard 2's armor with a large cover plate designed to improve the Leopard's protection against nuclear, biological, and chemical attacks. Next up came the 2A3, which implemented SEM8090 digital radio sets along with a new welding technique for the tank's ammo hatches. Finally, we come to the 2A4. Though not the most recent model of the Leopard 2, Germany released the 2A5 through 2A7 models in the years that followed, it is the most widespread and brought with it some wholesale changes to how Leopard tanks were designed. These changes included the installation of an automated fire and explosion suppression system, providing the tank with much-needed protection against the new crop of anti-tank weapons that were appearing in the later 1980s. An improved turret protected by tungsten armor was also added, as was a digital fire control system that made the tank capable of firing more types of ammunition. Let's zero in on that firepower. The Leopard 2A4 kept the L44 120mm smoothbore main gun that was used in the tank's previous iterations, though this older gun was bolstered by the new Digbal digital FCS fire system. That system equips the 2A4 with a ballistic computer that uses motion and environmental sensors, along with a laser rangefinder to identify and track potential targets. A handful of the 2A4 tanks produced, including the 200 built as part of the initial batch, included a PZB-200 night vision camera. That was later replaced by a WBG-X thermal imaging system, with it being likely that the Leopard 2A4 tanks Spain has donated are tanks that use this system. The tank has a 1,500 horsepower MTU diesel engine, with 5 fuel tanks spread across the vehicle, ensuring its operators can keep it running even if one of the tanks gets taken out. A nitrogen fire suppression system is in place, replacing the original halon systems to protect the tank from fires caused by explosions. And the 2A4 also has external smoke grenade launchers it can use to create a smoke screen when needed. Add a composite armor that makes heavy use of the previously mentioned tungsten, and you have a tank that packs a punch while also being able to take a hit. By now, you have identified a potential problem with this tank. It was made in the 1980s, or 1985 to be exact. That makes it a holdover from the dying days of the Cold War, leading some to speculate that the tank might not be able to match up to more modern tanks that Russia is fielding in Ukraine. That might have been the case were it not for the fact that Russia is barely using its modern tanks. According to Pravda, Russia has only deployed around 175 of its ultra-modern T-90M tanks to the front lines in Ukraine since February 2022. The majority of its tanks are older, with Putin relying on Soviet-era T-72s and T-62s to establish ground control, even going as far as to pull T-55s that were made just after World War II out of storage. He's also burning through these old tanks at an astonishing rate, with Ukraine's Ministry of Finance claiming that Ukraine has destroyed 8,636 Russian tanks as of September 8, 2024. So the Leopard 2A4s Spain is donating may not have been able to stand up against Russia's T-90Ms, but they won't have to. They'll be dealing with tanks that are even older. Better yet for Ukraine, Spain has committed to conducting full services and maintenance on the 19 2A4s it's sending, meaning they'll be in far better condition than many of the old Russian tanks that have been pulled out of storage and sent straight to the front lines with barely any maintenance being conducted on them. But perhaps more worrying for Putin than tanks will be the Patriot missiles Spain is sending to Ukraine. The Patriot air defense system has proven extremely helpful to Ukraine during its war with Russia. Though it only has 2 Patriot systems as of June 2024, with US President Joe Biden saying in July that America, together with Romania and Germany, is preparing to send a further 3 at some point in the future, it has made very good use of them. It's managed to use Patriot missiles to shoot down Russian Su-34 fighter jets from ranges of nearly 100 miles, showcasing the system's success against Russian aerial assets, as well as the ballistic missiles the Patriot was originally designed to counter. For context, the Su-34 is claimed by some to be Russia's top twin-seat fighter-bomber aircraft, meaning taking it out is important for Ukraine to prevent Russia from establishing aerial dominance over its territory. Back to the missiles. Spain is committed to sending 12 Patriot missiles to Ukraine, adding to the country's slowly growing stockpiles. Each of these missiles is about 17 feet long and is equipped with a track-via missile or TVM guidance system. That TVM is backed by a mobile engagement control center, which can transmit mid-course correction commands while the missile is in flight, allowing it to divert its course to ensure it hits its target. Behind this TVM sits a 198-pound high-explosive warhead, capable of destroying anything from Russian fighter jets to ballistic missiles. The missile has the range to back that firepower up too. It can travel for up to 43 miles, hitting an altitude of 14.9 miles, allowing it to hit an aerial target before it reaches its location, and even before it's descended to the point where it can do serious damage. It's fast too. A Patriot missile can reach speeds of up to 7,700 miles per hour, or Mach 10, meaning the missile can move at 10 times the speed of sound. That's why Ukraine has been able to use them to shoot Russian fighter jets out of the sky. The Su-34, for instance, has a top speed of Mach 1.8, meaning it's no match for the sheer speed of the Patriot. This is a missile that can shoot practically anything Putin can launch, right out of the sky. Still, there is some solace for Putin. Though it's clear that Spain has had enough of the Russian president's actions to the point where it's finally committing substantial military aid to Ukraine, that aid comes with a caveat. Unlike many of its NATO allies, including France, Germany, the UK, and even the US, Spain's weapons have a condition attached. Ukraine can't use them on Russian soil. Spanish President Pedro Sanchez made this clear on May 27th in the wake of making Spain's new military pact with Ukraine. When asked about Madrid's stance on allowing Ukraine to use NATO weapons inside Russia, Sanchez's response was, "We have neither such will or such intention, and I certainly have no information about this." In other words, Spain would not be joining its allies in permitting the use of weapons outside Ukraine. This stance may come as a surprise in the wake of Ukraine's invasion of the Russian oblast of Kursk in early August 2024. By now, it's clear that Zelensky has no intention of keeping the fight on Ukrainian soil. He's taking it to Putin's doorstep, and Ukraine is taking control of Russian territory as we speak. Right now, it holds about 465 square miles in Kursk, with 93 villages falling under Ukraine's control. Spain's decision to only permit Ukraine to use the weapons it provides defensively seems to run counter to Ukraine's new offensive strategy. Still, the stance shouldn't come as a surprise, given how slow Spain has been to act when compared to its European compatriots. The stance also shouldn't be taken as a sign that Spain is limiting its support of Ukraine either. This military funding is still a clear slap in Putin's face and a signal of intent from Spain. We see that in the officially released documentation of the Agreement on Security Cooperation Ukraine has signed with Spain, published on Zelensky's official website. The document goes into greater depth on the sheer breadth of the pact made between Spain and Ukraine, kicking off with a preamble in which Spain reaffirms its complete condemnation of Putin and his actions in Ukraine. Spain also committed to supporting Ukraine's right to defend itself per Article 51 of the UN Charter, as well as officially recognizing that Russia's invasion of Ukrainian sovereign territory is illegal. Spain also says that Ukraine should remain independent per the borders it had since 1991, while also broadening the cooperation and partnership between the two nations. Perhaps the key phrase in this agreement comes from its scope section. Spain is determined to provide support for Ukraine for as long as it takes, in coordination with its international partners and allies, in order to help Ukraine defend itself, as long as it takes. This pact isn't Spain giving a one-off donation to Ukraine. It's a full-blown commitment to offer continued support for as long as it takes for Ukraine to reassert its independence. That means the 5 billion euros Spain has pledged to provide up to 2027 may just be the start. If the war goes on for longer, Spain will make even more military donations. Yes, refusing to allow Ukraine to use Spanish weapons on Russian territory could be seen as Spain hedging its bets a little bit. That may be because Spain's decision isn't popular with everybody in Spain. On May 28, 2024, Euractiv reported that Sumar spokesman Ernest Urtasun has criticized Prime Minister Sanchez's decision to sign the agreement with Ukraine. For context, the Sumar party currently forms a coalition with Sanchez's PSOE party in Spain, with the party falling on the far left of the political spectrum. According to Urtasun, who also serves as Spain's culture minister, the green light for signing the agreement was given without Sanchez consulting the PSOE party. This lack of transparency is not serious when talking about an issue as important as defense, Urtasun sarcastically quipped, while also pointing out that Sanchez's recent decision to increase Spanish defense spending so it hits 2% of GDP was also made without Sumar input. Internal politics are clearly at play here, but that won't matter to Putin. Regardless of whether the Sumar party agrees with Sanchez's decision, Russia's leader has still been dealt a devastating blow. Diplomatically, Spain has made it clear that it wants Russia out of Ukraine so much that it's willing to support Putin's enemy for as long as it takes for that to happen. Spain has made a long-term commitment, with the first 10 of the promised Leopard 2A4 tanks having already arrived in Ukraine. The message is clear. Regardless of internal strife, Spain stands behind Ukraine more firmly than it has at any point during the Ukraine war. That's a slap in Putin's face, as it now means that every major European power has made it abundantly clear that they're uniting in wanting Putin out of Ukraine. What do you think about the support that Spain has pledged to Ukraine with this latest round of military aid, as well as its ongoing commitment to providing more in the future? Will it have a positive effect on Kyiv's ability to repel Russia's invading forces in the long term? In a stunning move that has left Moscow reeling, Sweden has delivered a crippling blow to Russian forces, shifting the tides of the conflict in Ukraine. This unprecedented aid package from Sweden, NATO's newest member, marks a historic departure from its traditional stance of neutrality. What secret strategies and cutting-edge technologies has Sweden unveiled to support Ukraine? How will this affect the balance of power in the region? Let's delve into the dramatic developments that have sent shockwaves through the Kremlin and bolstered Ukraine's fight for freedom. On May 29th, Sweden announced its 16th aid package to Ukraine. Tellingly, this was primarily a military rather than an economic or humanitarian aid package. It is designed to create Russian casualties, which would have been unthinkable for Sweden a few years ago. Such aid is a departure from Sweden's traditional foreign policy. Until Putin decided to invade Ukraine, Stockholm observed a policy of neutrality dating back to the Napoleonic Wars. The last time Sweden entered a conflict was in the Swedish-Norwegian War of 1814. The Swedish public widely supported their country's neutrality, and it was maintained during both world wars. As late as 2012, only 17% of Swedes expressed support for joining NATO. By 2021, the number increased to 46%. But Sweden was always wary of the threat from Russia. The two countries fought the long and bitter Great Northern War in the early 18th century over influence in the Baltic Sea. Sweden lost the conflict and has been on guard against Russia ever since. As early as 1904, Sweden was patrolling the Baltic with submarines to protect its coastline. That mission has given it more underwater experience in the Baltic than any other nation. The Gripen fighter was designed specifically to counter the threat from Russia. Even its radar system is designed to let it look toward Russian territory without flying in its direction. Fear of potential Russian aggression has entered Swedish cultural consciousness. Some of the older locals on Gotland Island, one of the most important locations in the Baltic and the likeliest place in Sweden that Russia would attack, reported in 2015 that they would hear stories from their parents warning that if they failed to finish their dinners, the Russians would get them. Back then, people on the island were divided over whether Swedish military should increase their presence there. No such divisions exist today. Putin's decision to invade Ukraine reawakened historical nightmares among the Swedish public and policymakers in Stockholm. Sweden announced its intention to join NATO a few months later and quickly became a partner to help Ukraine fend off the invasion. Like Germany, Sweden reversed its historical aversion to providing lethal military aid. It began with providing weapons like anti-materiel weapons, air defenses, and light vehicles. The investments increased, and Sweden demonstrated early on that it was willing to go far in its proportional investment in money and weaponry. On the first anniversary of the war, Sweden said it would donate 10 Leopard 2A5 tanks to Ukraine. Sweden's latest aid package is worth $1.23 billion. To put that into perspective, Sweden's total military spending in 2023 was $8.75 billion. Meanwhile, Sweden's total aid to Ukraine amounts to a little over $4 billion over the course of 16 packages since the invasion started. Such a proportionally large expenditure demonstrates Stockholm's threat perception. Russia's recent successes have required Stockholm to step up its spending even more. The pace of Sweden's separate aid packages also reflects Stockholm's wariness, as several have been passed in the last few months, and they have significantly increased in size. For example, in late February, Sweden announced a $682 million aid package, which was then its largest. The package included 10 CB-90 combat boats, 20 group boats, underwater weapons, $192 million worth of badly needed artillery shells, RBS-70 man-portable air defense systems, anti-tank missiles, Carl Gustaf grenade launchers, hand grenades, and medical supplies. Early in May, Sweden passed aid to help Ukraine secure its energy supply, since this section has been a particular target for Russian missiles and drones. This aid will be spent on equipment like generators, transformers, and solar cells. Will also include necessary spare parts like electrical switches, cables, pumps, and pipes. The May 29th aid package was about twice the size of the February aid package. It does not include donations of the JAS-39 Gripen fighter jet. Although Ukraine has expressed interest in this platform in the past and does not rule it out in the future, Kyiv wants to focus on implementing its F-16 program. Stockholm says that it's still working on the possibility of contributing the Gripen system later, but for now it's too much of an ask for Ukraine to divide itself between the two new fighter jet programs. Though it won't be able to donate fighter aircraft, the rest of the aid is substantial. Sweden's Deputy Prime Minister, Ebba Busch, said that the package consists of equipment that is at the top of Ukraine's priority list. Maybe the most important contribution for the immediate term is in the form of additional 155mm artillery shells. Sweden didn't specify how many shells will be provided, but the new ammunition will help to swell Ukraine's supply to well over 2 million rounds. This will ensure enough ammunition to keep Ukraine in the fight into 2025. The Swedes will also be donating RB-99 AMRAAM missiles, the equivalent of the AIM-120. Sweden's Ministry of Defense says that these missiles will be repurposed specifically to serve in ground-based anti-aircraft systems. Presumably, they'll be supplied for Ukraine's NASAMS units. This is important because Russia took to using its aviation to more effectively support its ground forces after Avdiivka fell, and the proper air support enabled Russian forces to make more rapid advances to the west. Ukraine used its NASAMS and other air defense units to shoot down some of the Russian planes. More ammunition will check Russian aviation and force Moscow to be more cautious with its air power. Sweden will also be sending its entire fleet of PBV-302 infantry fighting vehicles to Ukraine. These have been retired from Swedish service as the newer Combat Vehicle 90 replaced the PBV-302 in 2014. Stockholm thought it better to donate its older vehicles rather than keep them in storage. Sweden's official announcement of the aid mentioned that the Ukrainian army was organizing several new brigades and needed armored vehicles for their infantry companies, a demand the PBV-302 will help to satisfy. The PBV-302 is armed with a 20mm cannon mounted on a turret to the vehicle's right side. The cannon can be fed with drum magazines, which can each hold 30 rounds. A 7.62mm machine gun can be used as a secondary weapon. It has armor that can withstand 20mm rounds and weighs 12.3 tons. It comes with a crew of 3, the driver, who also serves as a mechanic, the gunner, and the commander. The vehicle can carry up to 8 soldiers in its landing compartment. Over 600 of these vehicles were produced between 1966 and 2014, but that's not the amount Ukraine will receive. Much of the fleet was decommissioned from 2005 onward. By 2018, there were at least 180 still in service in various degrees of readiness. These vehicles are likely the ones Sweden will now hand over to Ukraine. The vehicles are all set to be repaired and modernized to at least some extent before the transfer. The remaining spare parts and maintenance equipment for these vehicles will be donated as part of the package, as will the 20mm shells for the onboard cannons. The PBV-302 will not be the only land vehicles Sweden donates as part of its latest package. The aid also includes surplus fuel transport vehicles in use by the Swedish Armed Forces. Previously donated Swedish material will continue to get upkeep through this aid package. Stockholm intends to help Kyiv with its command and control through donations of terminals with subscriptions for satellite communications. To help with training and military doctrine, the Swedish Defense Research Agency will assist the Ukrainian Armed Forces in creating their own Defense Research Institute. There are also a number of financial support provisions in the package. Most importantly, Sweden will make investments to ensure that Ukraine can get aid on a large scale on a rapid basis. Sweden will permit all of the weapons provided by this package to be used against targets on Russian soil if that's what Ukraine finds proper. Stockholm also claims that it will be able to replenish all of the ammunition and equipment it's sending to Ukraine through new investments. The most notable contribution in the package came in the form of 2 Saab ASCC-890 airborne early warning and control planes. Swedish Defense Minister Paul Jonsson said that these aircraft would have the most significant impact on Ukraine's air defense network. These planes will better allow Ukraine to identify and track incoming missiles and drones. They can also spot targets of opportunity for offensive operations. Training Ukrainian Air Force personnel to fly these planes is also part of the Swedish aid package. Stockholm's decision to donate these aircraft was a significant step beyond the monetary cost. These were the only 2 AWACS aircraft in Sweden's fleet. The Swedes admitted that the donation of these planes and many other provisions in the package meant a temporary vulnerability in their territorial defense. However, they decided to take what Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson called a calculated risk. Perhaps the words of his Danish counterpart, Mette Frederiksen, came to mind. Early in 2024, she pointed out that it was better for European countries to sacrifice their own arsenals temporarily to ensure Russia's defeat far from their own homelands, rather than having to potentially use those weapons against an emboldened Putin far closer to home. Sweden plans to make up for the shortage of command and control planes by purchasing additional S-106 GlobalEye aircraft. This is Saab's newest AWACS aircraft and entered service in 2020. Sweden also insists that it has plans to replenish all of the ammunition and other equipment it will lose once they arrive in Ukraine. Sweden intends to do this by increasing its defense spending. In September 2023, Stockholm announced its intention to increase its military budget by 28% for 2024. Additional increases will come in 2025 and 26. These increases will put Sweden over the NATO target of spending 2% of GDP on defense by appropriations. The budget increases will also likely make Sweden an enduring and reliable partner for Ukraine. Stockholm has indeed already announced that its partnership with Ukraine will be for the long haul. On May 23rd, Prime Minister Kristersson said that Sweden will be providing Ukraine with $7 billion in aid over the course of 3 years to repel the invasion. The package released to Ukraine the following week was only the first of multiple packages to come, and those packages will likely get bigger as time goes on. Thanks to the increases in Sweden's military budget over the coming years, the country will be in position to deliver on this planned aid. The Ministry of Defense officially announced major planned investments in artillery systems and transport aircraft as part of the domestic defense spending program. These investments will put Sweden in a position to produce and deliver the weapons and ammunition Ukraine needs in the coming years. But how does Sweden's recent and coming aid impact Ukraine's ability to win the war of attrition? In December 2023, a report by the Estonian Ministry of Defense indicated that Ukraine could win the war in 2025 if it killed or maimed 100,000 Russian troops in 2024. While Russia has the ability to call many more soldiers than that to its colors, these people need to be trained properly and then assigned to a cohesive unit if they are to be effective on the battlefield. These units would quickly suffer casualties, creating even more demand for manpower that would in turn send troops to the front with even less training. It will be a vicious cycle that Russia, even with its much greater amount of available manpower than Ukraine, would not be capable of meeting. The Estonians estimated that if Ukraine met the 100,000 benchmark, it could reduce Russian training capacity to 80,000 properly trained troops per year. The rest would be ineffective cannon fodder. Sweden's donation, especially with the new artillery shells, will help Ukraine to achieve this objective. Since Ukraine killed or maimed an average of 172,000 Russian troops in each of the first 2 years of the war, this seems like it will be achievable, particularly with help from countries like Sweden. There is another side to this equation though. Ukraine must minimize its own losses, and that's where Sweden's recent aid package might make the most impact in the long run. Estonia's Ministry of Defense said that it was just as important to level up the training Ukrainian troops received from their Western allies. Over 100,000 Ukrainian troops have been trained by their Western allies since the war began. The training is not equal though. While most Western militaries have basic training courses that take 10 weeks, and then several months for more specialized tasks like demolition or sniping, most of the Ukrainian troops in the war have had only 5-week courses. Ukrainian troops have also sometimes complained that they have received improper training from their NATO allies, which have been influenced too heavily by the war on terror rather than the high-intensity state-based warfare that's taking place in Ukraine. This lack of adequate training has also ensured that Ukraine suffered about 200,000 casualties in the first 2 years of the war. Of particular importance is better training for Ukraine's officers. The Estonians recommended that foreign trainers should subject Ukrainian staff officers to a 10-week intensive training course. That way, Ukraine will be able to conduct proper operations at the brigade level. The current Ukrainian military can't do this at the moment, which is why most operations in the war have taken place at the platoon or company level. This approach to warfare has helped to keep Ukrainian armed forces nimble, but it's also had severe limitations. The Estonian Ministry of Defense pointed out these limitations. The effective span of control of a brigade for offensive operations is therefore approximately 2 companies. The result is that the Ukrainian military plans and executes operations with a horizon of exploitation limited to approximately 1,200 meters. This assessment may have been one of the more understated reasons why the offensive in Zaporizhzhia last year failed, even though Ukraine was able to penetrate 2 of Russia's formidable defensive lines there. It could not translate those gains into a bigger breakthrough because of Russian mines and improved artillery fire, but also because it simply could not effectively use the necessary amount of troops to conduct operations at the level required. Russia was able to summon reinforcements with helicopter support that halted the momentum of Ukraine's troops. Being able to bring more of them forward in a cohesive operation could have made the difference in generating the necessary momentum. Unfortunately for Kyiv, this was not available, but Sweden might be starting to change that. Sweden's assistance in creating a defense research institute for Ukraine could help with training its staff officers, preventing casualties, and ensuring more comprehensive operations at the brigade level, although this will take time to see results. It is time that Putin thinks he has on his side, but Sweden's coming aid sends the message that he might be wrong. Ukraine is well on the way to killing or maiming 100,000 Russians this year, even though its forces may have been slowly giving ground. The end of Ukraine's shell hunger, partially with the ammunition Sweden is set to deliver, will help ensure Ukraine stays in the fight for the war of attrition and can get past the contentious American presidential election. Sweden has emerged from over 200 years of military neutrality with surprising speed, and while there may be doubts about the feasibility of continuing to aid Ukraine in the United States, in Sweden there are none. Sweden doesn't have the luxury of an ocean to separate it from its old enemy. For Stockholm, it's better to defeat Russia on foreign soil than potentially need to defeat it on soil or in waters close to home. Even proportionally large investments and temporary depletion of domestic arsenals have not dissuaded Sweden's leaders from this opinion. Putin may hope that many of the countries that now oppose him will become exhausted with Ukraine over time and lose interest in continuing the effort. For deep historical reasons, Sweden is unlikely to be one of those countries, and that's important because it might be proportionally small, but it has a strong defense industry. It will also look bad if Sweden, the newest member of NATO and also one of its smaller participants, were to continue supporting Ukraine at significant cost to itself while the others did nothing. Sweden's support helps to ensure a broader European effort that could continue onward even if American aid falters. Sweden's historic decision to step up and deliver a significant blow to Russia through its aid packages marks a new chapter in the conflict. As NATO's newest member, Sweden's support highlights the unwavering commitment of Ukraine's allies to ensure regional stability and security. What impact will Sweden's aid have on the war dynamics? Only time will tell, but one thing is certain: Ukraine is not alone in its fight for freedom. What do you think of the support Sweden has lent to Ukraine throughout the war, and how will it affect Kyiv's ability to win the war of attrition? Russia's endless, messy war is dragging China down with it, and Beijing is losing patience. For Xi Jinping, Russia is looking less like a useful ally and more like a stumbling, ungrateful liability. Worse yet, China is starting to eye some of Russia's own territory, sharpening the knives for its back, while Russia is distracted in Ukraine. Xi's message to Putin is clear: get out of Ukraine, or else. And this isn't just about Ukraine. Russia has been pushing China's buttons for centuries. From stealing land in the 19th century to constant power plays, the relationship has always been shaky. To understand how deep this tension runs, let's take a closer look at their long, bumpy history. After World War II, China underwent major cultural and industrial changes, positioning itself as the Soviet Union's unofficial second-in-command in the communist world. At the time, the Soviet Union, one of the world's largest economies, provided China with essential resources, weapons, and military equipment, but their alliance was never smooth. When Stalin died, Mao Zedong expected China to take over leadership in the communist bloc. Instead, China remained second fiddle to the Soviet Union until its collapse in 1991. That power struggle still lingering today. Ironically, the US played a pivotal role in normalizing relations between China and the Soviet Union. With tensions still rising between the two, China saw the US, the enemy of its enemy, as a potential ally. This set the stage for an uneasy triangle where the Soviet Union, China, and the US each influenced the other's policies. Fast forward to the post-Soviet era. Russia, now the Russian Federation, sought to mend its relationship with China as both countries began to view the US as a growing geopolitical threat. This is the backdrop to today's so-called limitless alliance, an alliance built more on shared enemies than genuine friendship. For the last decade, this bond has deepened, thanks to the steady leadership of Putin and Xi, both working together to counterbalance US influence. But the cracks have always been there. China hasn't forgotten Russia's past betrayals, and Russia still views China with caution. And those cracks? They first became obvious during the Cold War, when a rivalry between supposed allies almost pushed them to the brink. But the bad blood between China and Russia stretches back much further than the Cold War. To see just how deep this rivalry runs, we have to go all the way back to the 19th century, when Russia was snatching land from China's grasp. While other imperial powers returned Chinese territory after the Opium Wars, Russia held on tight to what it grabbed, and China has never forgotten it. As part of the so-called unequal treaties, Russia claimed Outer Manchuria, a chunk of land that effectively blocks China from the Sea of Japan and gives Russia a strategic foothold in the region. This sparsely populated land might not seem like much, but its loss still stings. And it's not just about the land, it's about the rivers. The border between China and Russia, drawn along the Amur and Ussuri rivers, remains a constant source of friction. China believes these rivers should be shared, while Russia insists on controlling them outright, including the lucrative shipping routes they offer. Tensions boiled over in 1969 when the Soviet Union and China fought a bloody battle over Damansky Island, or Zhenbao as the Chinese call it. Hundreds died, but Russia claimed victory, a victory that still leaves a bitter taste in China's mouth. One particularly contentious spot is Bolshoi Orossiysk Island, Haixiazi. Strategically located at the confluence of the two rivers, this 130-square-mile island could be a key port for maritime transport. If China ever takes full control, it would put Russian territory and the major city of Khabarovsk right within striking distance. Russia knows how dangerous this is, which is why it's been desperate to hold on to it. And while the 2004 treaty gave China half the island, it's clear that's not enough for Beijing. In 2023, China released maps showing the whole island as Chinese territory, signaling that Xi Jinping hasn't let go of these territorial ambitions. Russia might have its hands full with Ukraine right now, but China is quietly sharpening its claws, waiting for the right moment to reclaim what it sees as rightfully theirs. And it's not just about a few disputed islands. Siberia and the Russian Far East, brimming with resources, are the real prize. But Russia's problems are even closer to home. Take Bolshoi Orossiysk Island, for example. While still largely undeveloped, its location makes it a highly strategic prize for both China and Russia. For Russia, the problem is painfully obvious. The island lies right across from Khabarovsk, the second largest city in the region, with a population of over 600,000. If China were to fully control the island, Khabarovsk would suddenly be a stone's throw from Chinese territory. Easy pickings if things get ugly. This isn't just a hypothetical nightmare for Russia. We've seen this play before. Just like with St. Petersburg during World War II, when Russia forcibly seized Finnish land to push its borders further from the city, Moscow will do whatever it takes to protect its so-called national interests. Outer Manchuria and these contested islands, they're no exception. Russia knows the stakes, but the game is slipping out of its hands. On paper, the dispute over Bolshoi Orossiysk was resolved by the 2004 treaty, which gave China half the island and access to key shipping routes along the Amur and Ussuri rivers. But as we know, China isn't one to settle for half. Sure, they got more than they bargained for without firing a shot, but Xi Jinping isn't done. Far from it. Xi is clinging to old grudges, and Russia's current weakness might be the perfect time to act. What Russia thought was a closed chapter could be blown wide open, and the island dispute is just one small part of a bigger picture. China's territorial ambitions don't stop with Bolshoi Orossiysk. The 2004 treaty might have given China half the island and some shipping rights, but it's clear that wasn't enough. In 2023, China published maps labeling the entire island as its own, signaling that Xi Jinping still has unfinished business. But that's not all. China also renamed key cities in Outer Manchuria, further stoking tensions. For Russia, this is more than political posturing, it's a warning. The same territory disputes that sparked conflict in the late 1960s could come back to haunt them, and China's eyes are now set on something far larger: Siberia and the Russian Far East. These resource-rich regions are becoming increasingly attractive to a China desperate for natural resources, and with a population 10 times larger than Russia's, China is better positioned than ever to make a move. One major prize? Lake Baikal, the world's largest freshwater lake by volume. With China's groundwater supply becoming increasingly undrinkable, the demand for fresh water is skyrocketing. Throughout the 2010s, Chinese companies tried to secure land around the lake to build pipelines that would pump water into China's densely populated regions. Though local protests forced Russia to shut these projects down, China's thirst for resources isn't going away. With 90% of its groundwater undrinkable, China now needs new sources, and Russia's remote, untapped territories are the perfect target. The stakes are high for both countries. Russia's struggling economy and shrinking population have left vast parts of its territory vulnerable, while China's growing need for natural resources is driving its ambitions. And Beijing, getting Russia out of Ukraine, is just the first step in a larger game. With the war being waged for over 2.5 years now, it's become clear that Russia's main attributes are aggressiveness and flagrant disregard for human life, both military and civilian, Russian and Ukrainian. This presents a huge issue for China, particularly due to its forward-thinking attempts to create a second axis of power and influence that would rival the US. And to create that axis, China will need more resources, which plays into one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects in the world, the Belt and Road Initiative. The BRI is a near-global project for China to expand its sphere of influence via roadways, cargo routes, and train tracks. Dubbed the New Silk Road, the goal of the project is to directly connect China with countries across the Himalayas, including the lucrative Middle East. Why? Oil and gas. Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Iraq are all among the top 5 countries in the world in terms of oil deposits and production. However, the only current oil trade between the Middle East and China is conducted via ships, which need to pass through the Indian Ocean and the Strait of Malacca. The strait in particular is one of China's sore spots, pretty much since every ship going from China to the west passes through it. And the strait is managed by Singapore, which is in turn allied with the US, with the latter having several military bases located near the strait. This presents a significant security and economic issue to China. If China wants to act on its long-term goal of trying to invade or occupy Taiwan, it needs to go directly against the US in that hypothetical scenario. The US, alongside other members of the Quad security dialogue, Australia, Japan, and India, would likely create an impenetrable barrier surrounding the Strait of Malacca, preventing Chinese trade ships from entering the Indian Ocean. With China dependent on naval trade routes, trying to import resources in this manner would be tantamount to political and economic suicide for a country so lacking in natural resources. And that's where the BRI comes in. By creating additional routes through which China can obtain its resources, it reduces the reliance it has on the Strait of Malacca for conducting trade and obtaining capital. Furthermore, the BRI initiative reaches far beyond the Middle East, as many as 145 countries have expressed interest in being a part of the project, many of which are developing nations in Africa and South America. Thus, the BRI can also help China carve more influence in the world and make itself a lucrative option for trade and geopolitical relationships. That being said, the BRI is nowhere near close to being complete. The project is estimated to cost as much as $10 trillion overall, and the first phases are only starting to appear in official planning documentation. Thus, China's primary goal as of now seems to be creating a stable overland connection to Pakistan. While not the BRI, this plan would be a significant victory for China, as it would allow trade to pass from China to Pakistan and then over into the Middle East, either via land or through the Arabian Sea. Either way, China can avoid both nations that have significant claims and influence in the Indian Ocean, those being the US and India itself. But what does Russia have to do with BRI? Russia itself is just one of the targets for the initiative, helping China secure more resources from Siberia. But more importantly, with Russia and China being allies, Russia's actions directly reflect on China. With Russia playing the role of an eternal aggressor and China closely monitoring or even helping Russia by providing it with weapons and helping it skirt around Western sanctions, nations that might be interested in becoming a major trading partner with China might turn to the US instead. And that's why China is so adamant about Russia getting out of the war in Ukraine one way or another. The longer the war goes on, the more disruption Russia will cause to its alliance with China simply by degrading the latter's influence with the rest of the world. Additionally, the proposed BRI is already an expensive proposition, but the COVID pandemic severely hit the economies of the same developing nations that would be ideal candidates for China's investments. With their economies slowing down, many of the investments that China had planned have not panned out at all. Some nations have been put into debt, so subsequent investments would cripple their economy and make them more dependent on China as a result. While this might be a good thing for China overall, it sets a particularly bad precedent for how China conducts its business and helps create a different axis of influence. Another wrench in the global economy has been the Russian invasion of Ukraine, one of the world's largest exporters of grain. Russia, meanwhile, is one of the largest exporters of oil and petroleum products. The invasion has impacted both in this regard, temporarily halting Ukraine's ability to export through the Black Sea, while Western sanctions on Russia have made it unable to trade with other countries. That's left Russia needing to conduct its trade through China. While the bilateral trade agreement between the two countries reached a record high amount of $240 billion in goods in 2023, the trade throughout has started to slow in 2024, likely as a result of sanctions catching up to China. Furthermore, the US has started to threaten Chinese banks that still conduct business with Russia, forcing China to choose between backing the Russian economy or maintaining its influence across the world. So what's China's solution to this dilemma? It seems that Xi is trying to maintain an illusion of neutrality in the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian conflict. However, this illusion quickly disappears when you realize how much China has been helping Russia and on multiple fronts. When Russia was hit with sanctions by most of the Western world, it was only left with BRICS, the intergovernmental alliance consisting of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and the United Arab Emirates. Their continued inclusion is likely due to the fact it's still a possible major oil and gas exporter. It's highly probable that BRICS is being led by China on all accounts, and Russia only gets to play along since it's still a relatively big economy on par with some of the other members. Most of the BRICS members have been helping Russia skirt around the sanctions by importing goods from other countries, relabeling them, and then sending them to Russia. Out of all the BRICS countries, China by far has the most influence and impact on the Russian economy. With Russia practically banned from using the US dollar, the countries have turned to the yuan and ruble to conduct bilateral trade. This hasn't slowed Russia's economy as much as the Western world would have hoped when the sanctions first hit. Additionally, while China has been peddling the idea that it doesn't directly support Russia's advances in Ukraine, the reality is quite different. Since Russia doesn't actually produce most of the high-tech parts that go into modern weapons and vehicles, it turns out China was the country's biggest supplier all along. China has also been using its immense industrial capacity to manufacture parts for the Russian war machine. The BBC estimates that 70% of all machine parts and 90% of all electronics and microchips that end up in Russia come either directly from or through China. All of these factors make it clear that while China and Russia have a strong alliance, it's actually more tenuous and uneven than it looks. For all the support China has been providing to Russia over the 30 months of war, Russia hasn't managed to make any significant progress in pushing further into Ukraine. Throughout the entire 2024, in fact, Russia has occupied roughly 600 square miles of territory. On the other hand, Ukraine has managed to achieve pretty much the same level of control of the Russian region of Kursk within a few weeks. With Russia unwilling to back down from its current war efforts, it turned to China for support, and China's plan for Russia to get out of the war is pretty bold. China's proposal for the so-called peace agreement is to simply proclaim the current situation as the status quo. China would like to see Russian sanctions dropped, which would allow it to trade more openly with China, thus further entrenching its influence in Russia, all fighting to stop, and the current territory that Russia occupied remains under tentative Russian control. The statements that China has issued are also controversial because China still maintains that it's a neutral country in the conflict, despite overwhelming evidence that it supports Russia. Their peace agreement plan would essentially help Russia win the war. But regardless of what China's statements actually are, the intent is clear. It wants Russia to get out of Ukraine, even if that means redrawing the Ukrainian borders. Otherwise, China may see its alliance with Russia degrade heavily in the coming months. If the Western threats of sanctioning Chinese banks become reality, it could mean a big hit for the Chinese income from trade with Russia. Additionally, the increasing NATO support for Ukraine means that Ukraine has been receiving more and more modern weaponry. NATO's chief officers believe that it might be time to give the green light to Ukraine to let them use the long-range missiles donated to them to strike deeper into Russia. This could potentially turn the tide of the war itself. If Moscow gets directly attacked, Putin might lose all of his leverage within the country and public support. Why does this matter? Well, as we established previously, both China and Russia haven't had a change in leadership in over a decade. If the war in Ukraine starts going sideways for Russia, there might be a scenario where Putin is forced to leave his post as the president, or worse, gets forcibly deposed in a revolution. Should that happen, there's no telling whether the next head of the Russian state maintains such close ties with China. If there's enough pressure from the West, the new government might turn 180 degrees towards the US, completely changing the geopolitical situation, not only for China, but perhaps for the world as a whole. And China doesn't want that to happen under any circumstance. That's why Xi is adamant about wanting the war to end as soon as possible. Seeing as Russia doesn't have any plans of relenting in its advance in Ukraine, its only option is to make bold proposals that might hopefully sway the world leaders into accepting the outrageous terms. But if that doesn't happen, and it probably won't, what's going to happen to the Russia-China alliance? Truthfully, probably not much, at least for a few years. As of now, China is still relatively happy with how its economy is growing and how much influence it can garner from other countries. So long as their BRI plans don't stray too far off course, countries would likely turn to China out of necessity, putting them right where China wants them. As for Russia, it might not be the biggest benefactor of China's economy for long. If the banks stop working with Russia, its economy might spiral out of control. This would turn its partial dependence on China into a full one, effectively allowing Xi Jinping to control the Kremlin's war and geopolitical rhetoric. If China closes the valve of money and weapon parts coming into Russia, the latter might be forced to submit. But that would put China in a bind, as it would need to publicly announce that it's stopping the already illegal skirting of sanctions. This could cause it to lose popularity with the BRI nations. Effectively, the problem between China and Russia is circular in nature. Both countries need one another, but Russia won't listen to China's demands, and China doesn't have enough influence to force other countries to do the same. On paper, this caustic combination should have caused the alliance to dissipate, but China is also using Russia as a scapegoat and leverage to garner support from other countries that are not as friendly to the US. In China's mind, perhaps truthfully, if they were to leave Russia to be the sole enemy of NATO, there might be no telling how BRICS countries would split their allegiances. While the alliance is informal in nature, its members have shown that they can support Russia in its ongoing war effort, which they may continue to do without China leading the pack. With many of the members taking a wait-and-see approach to the war in Ukraine and how it affects global geopolitics and economy, China is practically forced to do the same. Despite all of that, China still has one final trick up its sleeve through its border dispute with Russia. If Putin doesn't relent in his ongoing war effort, China might just decide to act on this. It would practically force Russia to choose between invading Ukraine and keeping its Far East secure. This would be one way to get Russia out of the current war, albeit by forcing them into the next one. Only this time, China wouldn't be helping Russia at all. Considering how inept the Russian military has proven to be at invading Ukraine, China could very likely succeed at occupying Outer Manchuria without significant difficulty and reinforce its previous claims on the region. But it's also possible that China will go a step further and move deeper into Siberia to get the true bounty of the land: access to Russian natural resources. Without Russia being the go-between for trade, China's industry will be poised to reach new heights, with free access to more minerals, timber, oil, and water. Of course, in this scenario, there are two factors that make life difficult for China. First, the US is already mounting pressure on China with regard to Taiwan and reinforcing its stranglehold on the Strait of Malacca. If China makes an offensive move, the US might follow. This could plunge the world into a new world war, with alliances quickly coming undone between countries that support the US and NATO, with Russia and China each playing their part. Secondly, Russia is virtually tied with the US for the world's largest arsenal of nuclear weapons, with about 1,700 nukes each ready to go at the push of a few buttons. China also has a nuclear weapons supply of 500 warheads, but only about 24 of them are ready to go, and even those are in uncertain condition. With Russia's nuclear deterrence policy being that it justifies the use of nuclear weapons should another country with access to nukes attack them, Putin might just press the mutually assured destruction button. But with a concentrated attack on China, Russia wouldn't even need to use most of its nuclear bombs, just enough to replicate the attack on Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in World War II. It would set the Chinese economy and industry basically back to where it was at its beginnings as a communist country. So China must plan things carefully. Its only feasible option is to repeatedly warn Russia to get out of the war with Ukraine before it's too late. But it also can't sever ties with the country, as the BRI isn't nearly ready yet. Thus, the alliance between Russia and China will stay strong on paper, but both sides will start making contingency plans that will need to be adapted depending on how the war effort is going. But what do you think? Will China force the issue on Russia to get out of the war? Ukraine is about to receive a revolutionary weapon system that could redefine drone warfare: the Australian-developed Slinger. You've seen the devastating impact of drones in countless news reports and social media videos, wreaking havoc on buildings, vehicles, soldiers, and infrastructure. The Slinger system promises to turn the tide in the battle against swarms of low-tech lethal drones. But what makes the system so special? How does it work? And why is it so desperately needed on the Ukrainian front lines? Stay with us as we uncover the cutting-edge technology behind the Slinger, its unparalleled capabilities, and the strategic advantage it offers Ukraine in this high-stakes conflict. But to understand how the Slinger can turn the tide in Ukraine, let's first delve into its impressive technical specifications and capabilities. Developed by Australian defense company Electro-Optic Systems, the Slinger counter-drone system offers an elegantly simple yet highly effective solution to a complex problem. Weighing just over 700 pounds, this self-contained unit is a formidable drone killer. Its primary weapon, a 30mm M230LF Bushmaster chain gun, is complemented by a Belgian-made FN Mag 58 7.62 caliber machine gun. With a 150-round ammunition drum for the chain gun and customizable belted ammunition for the machine gun, the Slinger is ready for action. If fired simultaneously, the chain gun can shoot up to 200 rounds a minute, and the FN Mag 58 can shoot around 650 to 1,000 rounds per minute. That's quite a bit of lead going downrange toward a cheap quadcopter, but that's not all the Slinger can do. Beyond its robust armament, the Slinger boasts cutting-edge detection technology that ensures no drone goes unnoticed. Equipped with advanced detection tools, the Slinger can pinpoint potential drone threats with precision. Its four-dimensional sensor unit continuously emits lasers to measure distances accurately, working in tandem with its primary radar to find, fix, track, and destroy enemy drones. At the heart of the Slinger is the American-made EchoGuard electronically scanned array radar. This revolutionary radar system, typically found in much larger, standalone units, has been miniaturized for compact use. The EchoGuard excels in finding, classifying, and tracking targets of virtually any size under almost any weather. Utilizing unique onboard software capabilities that assist the EchoGuard in differentiating even the smallest and fastest moving of targets, little can escape its gaze. But how does the radar work? As a phased array radar, it sends energy pulses in one direction at a time. These pulses coincide with the maximum area of coverage the radar can see and happen so fast it can give data throughout its whole field of view as close as possible to real time. For the EchoGuard, it operates in the K-band frequency range of 24.05 and 24.65 GHz. This incredibly high frequency range is great for producing high-fidelity data at short ranges, just what the Slinger needs to do. In addition to having this great data while tracking enemy drones, the operator can set the radar to a 10 Hz search while tracking function even while the Slinger is engaging a target. This is a very valuable capability, since it allows the operator not to get sucked into the current problem and able to look ahead for the next threat constantly. Another great feature of this radar is its field of view, with the ability to scan up to 80 degrees high in the air with a 120-degree cross-section. The EchoGuard radar can provide more than enough coverage for the Slinger's own field of view, which is up to 70 degrees straight up and 10 degrees down. But how does the gun stay on target when shooting from a moving platform? Thanks to a gimbal system, the Slinger can stay on target no matter the shooter's speed or drone speed to within 1 milliradian. A milliradian is 1,000th of a radian, the angle that intercepts an arc equal to the circle's radius. In plain language, this means that the margin of error for the Slinger is so small, it's almost not even measurable. But how far can the Slinger really see? EOS testing data reveals that the Slinger can detect targets over 12,000 meters away with its daylight camera and more than 13,700 meters with its thermal imaging camera. While this information is sufficient for radar registration, high-quality firing solutions are achieved within 5,600 meters for daylight and 5,100 meters for thermal imaging. For higher quality data that can be used to actually shoot something down, a potential drone would need to fly within 5,600 meters of the daylight camera and 5,100 meters of the thermal imager. Once inside this range, the Slinger can begin engaging the target since the operator has enough information to know the drone's bearing, range, and speed. If the drone closes another 500 meters, the operator can even tell the exact make, model, and type of drone. However, drones are only one of the targets the Slinger can engage. Because of the multi-threat environment in which the Slinger system will operate, drones are not the only adversaries the operator might need to contend with. From operational testing of the system, the Slinger can accurately detect and engage vehicles at distances of over 3.5 kilometers, enemy soldiers at 2.2 kilometers, and some of the most common, smallest quadcopters at distances of just over a kilometer. Rounding out the Slinger's system's main parts are a few other sensors and pieces of equipment that help it to operate. One of these is a wind sensor mounted on the top right of the unit that continually feeds wind data into the Slinger's algorithm. Controlling the Slinger is a 50-pound control unit situated inside the vehicle. This control unit is almost like a video game, where a user can accurately find, fix, and engage targets with the push of a button. Now that we've gone over a good bit of the technical details of the system, the question still remains of how the Slinger is so effective at shooting down small drones. The answer to that question is not what you think. Before Electro-Optic Systems became a defense company, it was a trailblazer in Australia's space industry, pioneering the best way to track objects in near-Earth orbit up to 36,000 kilometers. But how are they able to do this, and why track objects in space? According to recent data, there are more than 29,000 pieces of space debris larger than 10 centimeters, 670,000 more than a centimeter, and a staggering 170 million pieces of space junk larger than a millimeter. And all of this space junk is not just standing still. All the debris is flying around in near-Earth orbit at speeds of around 18,000 miles per hour, about 7 times that of a bullet. When combined with the fact that around 6,000 satellites are orbiting the Earth at any given time, keeping track of this enormous amount of space debris becomes a big issue. Even the smallest piece of junk hitting one of these satellites could be catastrophic. EOS came into the field to help solve this problem. Founded about 40 years ago, the company has become Australia's and one of the world's leading experts in tracking small, fast-moving objects around the Earth. While the company does a lot of research to explore deep space, the primary focus has been crafting cutting-edge lasers and optics that can measure these very small but extremely fast-moving objects within 1 millimeter of accuracy. Because of the decades of experience in doing this line of work, it's no wonder that Slinger was a natural transition for the company to go from space exploration to defense products. Essentially, the technology on Slinger has been in development for decades in the space industry, and the company is now miniaturizing this technology to become a drone's worst nightmare. But of course, the company needs more than just powerful lasers and cool optics to track this fast space debris. It also needs extremely powerful software programs. While the exact capabilities of electro-optic systems' computer algorithms are kept under wraps as a company secret, they are without a doubt powerful. After all, with their lasers tracking tens of millions and potentially more than 100 million objects at any given time of the day, the amount of data that the company is processing is, for lack of a better word, astronomical. To then be able to take this massive amount of raw data, sort it, process it, and then have a usable product in real time within a millimeter of accuracy takes some serious computing power. For Slinger, this software is at the heart of its capabilities. With the ability to intake a huge amount of data from its EchoGuard radar, Slinger then needs to make sense of this information on very small, fast-moving targets in real time for the operator to actually engage them. But how is Slinger adapted from a cool science project to military use? According to press releases from the company, the beauty of the Slinger is that it can be modified to practically anything with wheels. While the official contract Ukraine signed for 160 units has 110 being fitted to M113 armored personnel carriers and 50 going to Bushmaster 4x4 trucks, the Slinger can be fitted to almost any type of vehicle. When EOS showed off Slinger's capabilities at the firing range with live drones, operators fired the unit from Denali pickup trucks. With the ability to turn everything from a simple pickup truck to an armored vehicle to a tank into a mobile drone point defense system, Slinger's utility is really only limited by the operator's imagination. So why is the Slinger really needed in Ukraine? Since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the type of fighting has been ever-changing. Due to the absolutely massive casualties the Russians suffered in both terms of soldiers and material, they began looking for ways to preserve their combat power. As for Ukraine, since they've remained the underdog in this fight from the beginning, across all metrics like number of personnel, equipment, and economy size, they too have sought to expand their combat power in a realistic way. In the end, both sides ended up choosing drones to meet their respective needs. But how bad has drone warfare gotten? According to reports from the battlefield, the use of drones has become absolutely critical to how both sides fight this war. They perform a wide variety of functions on both sides. The first and most obvious of these is reconnaissance. Both Russia and Ukraine have bought or developed their own reconnaissance drones. This is because of the depth of Ukraine's air defenses and the strength of Russia's air force. Neither side can get an advantage in the skies. Because of this, both sides rely heavily on reconnaissance drones, since if they get shot down, it's much better price to pay than a multi-million-dollar aircraft and pilot. While reconnaissance drones like Ukraine's UKR jet or Russia's Orlan do a lot of the long-range reconnaissance that is then fed back to higher headquarters, both sides also use larger attack drones. Russia has famously buddied up with Iran to procure thousands of so-called kamikaze Shahid drones, which are meant as one-time use drones that fly at fast speeds and pack a huge punch. To date, Russia has employed more than 4,000 such drones in its illegal conquest of Ukraine. Ukraine has also developed or procured a wide variety of armed drones. Most famously, it's used the Turkish-made Bayraktar drone and the domestically produced UKR jet UJ-22 biplane. But while these attack drones and loitering munitions have played a huge part in the fighting, their use is underscored by an even bigger threat: first-person view drones. Known for short as FPV drones, these small drones are the true menace on the battlefields of Ukraine. They serve various functions. The first of these roles is to serve as local reconnaissance drones. With a range of 5 to 20 kilometers, these small drones are perfect for local company-sized units to have their own intelligence-gathering tool at all hours of the day. In addition to this role, both Ukrainian and Russian artillery units use FPV drones to help spot their fires. While traditionally a forward observer would be embedded with forward units to report what he saw, now a forward observer can get a top-down view in real time and correct fires without playing a game of telephone on the radio. But despite these advantages, the true terror in FPV drones comes in their bomb-dropping capabilities. Both sides employ huge drone manufacturing capabilities dedicated to making small FPV drones or using money to buy civilian quadcopters on the open market. Dotted across Ukraine are hundreds of ad hoc factories set up in abandoned homes, hospitals, and bunkers where Ukrainian volunteers use a variety of methods to not only cobble together FPV drones from open-source parts, but also modify munitions like anti-tank grenades, regular hand grenades, RPG warheads, and mortar shells so they're able to be dropped from these small drones. For Russia's part, they too have hundreds if not thousands of factories both inside occupied Ukraine and inside Russia producing FPV drones on a similar scale. To put some of the numbers into perspective, the Ukrainian government has set a target of 1 million FPV drones to be domestically produced in the country in 2024. This number does not include the huge numbers of FPV drones Ukraine buys on the open market or that are donated by allied countries every day. Both sides of the conflict use FPV drones for a variety of purposes. They use them to target and take out tanks, artillery pieces, armored vehicles, and worst of all, harass and kill unsuspecting individual soldiers anytime, anywhere. Due to the complete proliferation of FPV drones, coming up with ways to take them out has been a priority for Ukraine. But this has been easier said than done. While Ukraine has been provided with some of the West's most capable anti-air systems, they are not necessarily the best choice for taking out drones. For example, the US Patriot and NASAMS systems, along with European weapons like the Iris-T, are all incredibly powerful, accurate, and versatile anti-air defenses. The only problem is they're costly to operate. With a unit cost running into the hundreds of thousands of dollars per missile, every time Ukraine fires the weapon, there could be millions of dollars spent per engagement. When firing against Shahed drones with a unit cost in the tens of thousands of dollars, or worse, against an FPV drone with a price in the thousands or even hundreds of dollars, using these highly capable air defense systems is a sunken cost fallacy that Ukraine is on the wrong side of. To counteract wasting precious ammunition on drones meant to exhaust Ukraine's missile supplies and stop the flow of expensive Western aid into the war zone, Ukraine's Western backers have provided a variety of other anti-air systems that the country has put to good use. For example, Germany's legacy Gepard and newer Skynex air defense systems have been donated and proven useful on the battlefield. Utilizing high-capacity autocannons to shoot down short-range, fast-moving targets, these vehicles have downed significant numbers of drones. However, at only around 50 total units operational, these are just a drop in the bucket for what's needed. Ukraine's Western backers have also provided a variety of other air defense systems explicitly geared for drone defense. For example, Lithuania has donated thousands of Skywiper electronic drone mitigation systems. These small portable units are great for point defense of local units that can keep them in a vehicle or trench due to weighing just 14 pounds. The Skywiper works by jamming the radio frequency signals the operator sends to control the drone. But while these systems are great for protecting smaller areas within 3 miles, visible drones outside this range are not susceptible to their effects. Even worse, due to the increased number of GPS jammers on the battlefield, Russia has been hardening its own weapons to become even more jam-resistant, lessening the usefulness of such tools. Another counter-drone system that Ukraine has utilized is the Terrahawk Paladin counter-drone system. Adapted from MSI's Navy variant for land use, the Terrahawk is very similar to Germany's Skynex. Utilizing a powerful autocannon, it's designed to perform point defense in an area of up to 3 kilometers, using its own radar suite. However, unlike Skynex, the Terrahawk is a static weapon, meaning it cannot move on its own and is very vulnerable to enemy counterfire. Ukraine has also not received very many of this system either. The US has also donated several drone defense weapons, including the new Vampire by L3 Harris. Of all the donated drone defense weapons, the Vampire is the most similar to the Slinger. It is its own self-contained unit fully equipped with radar and a control unit that can be mounted onto most pickup trucks. But unlike the Slinger, the Vampire has a 4-rocket pod that can fire 70mm guided rockets or similar munitions. However, despite being very similar, price and capacity are the main drawbacks. At $27,500 per rocket, the Vampire is still on the wrong side of the math equation when shooting down drones worth $500 each. Additionally, with just 4 rockets, a Vampire system could quickly run out of ammunition in a real fight where multiple drones are coming from different angles of attack. Lastly, reloading this weapon while under fire is no easy task, and when out of ammunition, the operator would likely have to egress the area to reload and get back in the fight. As one can see, though Ukraine has received a lot of Western aid, no single system can yet meet the cost-effectiveness and versatility needed when shooting down swarms of FPV drones. So what are the advantages of the Slinger over some of these systems? Arguably, one of the Slinger's best advantages is the cost. Firing 30mm and 7.62mm rounds, the Slinger can engage a huge number of drones for about a couple of $100 to $1,000 per engagement. Compared to the hundreds of thousands of dollars of some of the advanced systems, the Slinger finally gets Ukraine on the right side of the cost equation. Another pro is that the Slinger is very adaptable to whatever platform the Ukrainians need it to go on. Currently, larger air defense systems like the Patriot come with several modules, including the firing unit, radar, command post, and other containers. These containerized systems cannot move quickly on the battlefield. For other legacy systems like Gepard and Skynex, these systems can cost millions of dollars, plus have expensive maintenance to keep the vehicles operational. Additionally, getting a replacement in the field is tough if the vehicle takes any substantial battle damage. On the other hand, Slinger is much more versatile, in that it can be mounted on a pickup truck, tank, or armored personnel carrier, or in a static position. With the ability to quickly displace and be replaced due to its low cost of around $1 million, the Slinger beats out the other mobile platforms. Because the Slinger system is so small, its radar cross-section and energy are much lower than those of other air defense systems. Countries like Russia have developed a wide range of emission-seeking munitions that look for radar energy from an air defense site and home in on it. However, because the energy output from this system only goes a few kilometers and is very small, when operating, Slinger is practically invisible to Russian aircraft unless they are right over the top, which would be a whole other problem in and of itself. But despite these pros, there are a few disadvantages to the system that could eventually give the Russians a way to defeat it. One way is its ability to integrate into Ukraine's overall air defense network. Due to the limited range of its radar, the firing unit would have to be able to share data with assets that have a longer range in order to be forewarned for incoming attacks. Not having this capability to share data can leave operators vulnerable and surprised by massed Russian attacks. This ties directly into the Slinger's next con. In Ukraine, it's been increasingly common for Russia to employ ever-increasing numbers of drones in multi-axis attacks against Ukrainian positions. Though the live-fire demonstrations in Australia were impressive, it should be noted that these were all single-drone engagements. Though Slinger could very well encounter single FPV drones since they're so common, it's increasingly more common to see multiple drones at one time. How Slinger will fare against these multi-threat engagements may only be known when Ukraine uses it on the battlefield. But despite these cons, Slinger will undoubtedly be a game-changer on the battlefield, filling a hole in Ukraine's air defense network. But what do you think? Do you think the Slinger will change the dynamics of drone warfare on the battlefield? Russian President Vladimir Putin is in crisis mode. After approximately 2.5 years of fighting, his military still hasn't been able to take Ukraine. In fact, for every territorial gain comes an even fiercer Ukrainian response. Worse yet for Putin, that response is increasingly being backed by the rest of the world. Hundreds of billions of dollars in military aid have been sent to Ukraine, with commitments being made for many billions more. Plus, Putin now has to face up to the fact that his actions have resulted in many NATO members taking steps to rearm themselves so that they're prepared for a possible conflict with Russia. This was not how the annexation of Ukraine was supposed to go. Russia anticipated storming in and taking the country in a matter of weeks, with the West not even having a chance to respond. That didn't happen. Still, at least it's just the West Putin has to worry about, right? It's no surprise that Russia's age-old enemy has come to Ukraine's defense. To Putin, this is just another example of the West trying to exert geopolitical control over the rest of the world by sticking its collective nose into business with which it has nothing to do. Except it's not just the West that opposes Russia. Since the outbreak of the Ukraine war, Japan has positioned itself as not only a partner to Ukraine, but an increasingly viable enemy to Russia. Now the country has dealt another devastating blow to Putin's ambitions and, with further changes to its internal policy, could become an even bigger thorn in the Russian president's side. That brings us to the video. We're going to dig into the latest devastating blow Japan has dealt Russia, along with exploring everything else that Japan is doing to oppose Putin's regime. You'll also learn why all of this is happening in the first place before we explore the key debate that rages on about Japan's approach to the Ukraine conflict. But first, the devastating blow. In February 2024, officials from Japan and Ukraine met to discuss a new investment treaty that could essentially act as a way for Japan to funnel money into Ukraine even as it faces constant bombardment from Russia. During those treaty negotiations, Japan reaffirmed a vow it made at the beginning of the conflict to continue providing support to reconstruct Ukraine. Those talks were extremely productive. Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida announced a bilateral tax treaty in which both countries will codify a set of tax rules that prevent double taxation of companies and individuals. In other words, Japanese investors who want to pour money into Ukraine no longer need to worry about being taxed by both Japan and Ukraine. While this may seem small, it's a sign that Japan is increasingly committed to helping Ukraine by making it easier for its investors to spend the money in the country. Money that Ukraine sorely needs to rebuild and fund its fight against Russia. Japan will support these new tax rules by easing visa controls, again making it easier for Japanese investors to enter and invest in Ukraine, in addition to providing more support to Japanese venture capital companies in Ukraine. Though Kishida didn't provide further details at the time, his Ukrainian counterpart Denis Shmyhal later posted on the social media platform Telegram that Japan would create a two-part program through which it would provide $1.35 billion in support to Japanese investors working in Ukraine. That's $1.35 billion that could turn into many more billions over time, all money Ukraine can use to fund both its war effort and its reconstruction. According to Shmyhal, the new tax treaty also opens doors for major Japanese car makers such as Toyota and Honda to open factories in Ukraine. Again, these production facilities are future-focused, providing work for Ukrainians after the war while showcasing how international companies are far more willing to do business with Ukraine than they are with Russia. A devastating blow for Putin. And it's not the only blow that Japan has landed in recent months. According to Voice of America, Japan had already provided $10 billion in aid to Ukraine as of February 2024. It's important to note that this aid has been both humanitarian and financial, not the type of military aid that many other countries have provided. Following the conference between Ukraine and Japan's prime ministers, it was also revealed that Japan has pledged to provide a further $12 billion in financial assistance, of which $4.7 billion would arrive in Ukraine by the end of February 2024. That places Japan among the top 5 countries in the world in terms of providing financial aid to Ukraine, only falling behind the US, Germany, the UK, and various European institutions. The message being delivered to Putin by Japan is clear: Tokyo supports Ukraine. And if Putin didn't receive that message from this new volley of financial commitments, he'd have certainly gotten it when Fumio Kishida stood in front of the US Congress to deliver a speech on April 11, 2024. On that day, Kishida told Congress that US leadership on the global stage is indispensable, reinforcing Japan's commitment to what Putin would consider the Western global hegemony. Pointedly, Kishida also told those assembled, "As I often say, Ukraine of today may be East Asia of tomorrow," before further lauding the US for the support it provides not just to Ukraine, but to the Indo-Pacific region. He characterized Putin's special military operation as an onslaught from Moscow and asked how long it would be before countries in the Indo-Pacific, Japan included, would face similarly harsh realities were it not for American intervention. Kishida wrapped up the speech with a simple message to Putin: Japan will continue to stand with Ukraine. If Putin believed he had any hope of repairing his relationship with Japan, at least while the Ukraine war is ongoing, those 7 words put an end to that notion. But in truth, the relationship between the two countries has been tense for decades, with Japan's announcement of more financial aid to Ukraine being just the latest in a series of disagreements that have built up to this moment. Disagreements such as those over a small collection of islands that Russia calls the Kurils and Japan dubs the Northern Territories. In the wake of World War II, the Soviet Union seized these islands, which are just 810 miles northeast of the northernmost Japanese island of Hokkaido. That seizure has been disputed ever since, with Reuters pointing out that World War II hostilities between Japan and Russia have still not ended due to their differing stances on these islands. These stances have only grown more resolute due to recent Russian actions. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, Russia appeared to be on the verge of handing the Northern Territories back to Japan during the early 2010s. That possibility actually had an impact on Japan's foreign policy, claims CSIS, as former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe spent much of his tenure working to improve relations between Japan and Russia to create enough goodwill to enable an agreement to be reached. Diplomatic talks, joint tourism projects, and even Japanese investment in local Russian economic development all stemmed from this approach. But Russia essentially took all of that goodwill and tossed it aside. Since 2015, Russia has been steadily increasing its military presence in the Northern Territories, with satellite imagery showing Putin has been building infrastructure that CSIS claims reaches as close as 14 miles away from Hokkaido. These developments include the building of barracks large enough to host a population of 7,000 on Kunashiri, along with the storage of BAL anti-ship missiles or ASMs on the island. That island's southernmost point lies just 10 miles away from Japanese territory. Similar developments include the construction of barracks and installation of Bastion ASMs on Itarofu, just 50 miles outside Japanese territory, along with the expansion of a base and development of a Russian airfield on Paramashiri. That island is just 380 miles from Japan. The BAL and Bastion ASMs have ranges between 185 and 310 miles, leading to Russia essentially sending a message to Japan that it could strike practically any ship near Hokkaido if it wished to do so. Tensions were being raised throughout the 2010s. Then came Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which led to Japan showing that it wouldn't be cowed by Putin's aggression. Even with a growing Russian threat looming to its north, Japan had consistently provided financial aid to Ukraine. Furthermore, the country was one of the first to coordinate with the US and other members of the Group of Seven, or G7 nations, a collective of the world's 7 strongest economic powers, to implement punitive sanctions. These initial sanctions included asset freezes, restrictions on SWIFT payment access, and restrictions on the import and export of various controlled items. More sanctions have followed. April 2022 saw Japan revoke Russia's most favored nation status. More asset freezes and export bans were implemented, including bans on luxury goods from Russia. Even in 2024, Japan continues to build on its sanctions. February 2024 saw it join with the G7 to place a price cap on Russian oil, with even more asset freezes and export bans coming in March, April, and June. Japan has also shown its support for Ukraine in other ways. For instance, Fumio Kishida was the president of the G7 in 2023, a position he used to ensure that global attention remained on Russia's actions in Ukraine, according to CSIS. His actions included visiting Kyiv in March 2023, the first time a Japanese leader has visited an active conflict zone since World War II. Uncoincidentally, that visit to Kyiv happened around the same time that Putin held a summit in Moscow with China's President Xi Jinping, with the two events seeming to be the drawing of lines in the sand between the 4 nations. Kishida's wartime visit also marked a break in Japanese tradition, in which it generally focused on diplomacy rather than directly supporting sides in conflicts. Japan was no longer keeping out of the war. Through Kishida, Ukraine has also been given an opportunity to build relationships with Asian nations it may not have otherwise worked alongside. For instance, May 2023 saw Japan's Prime Minister invite Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky to a G7 summit, to which Kishida has also invited representatives from India, the African Union, and the Association of Southeast Nations. It was another blow to Putin, as he saw his current rival engaging in diplomatic conversations with countries he would like to curry favor with. So we see the latest blow Japan has dealt to Russia. The promise of billions of dollars in ongoing financial aid is actually just the largest following several diplomatic jabs Japan has delivered. All of this leads us to a question. Why has Japan chosen to now fully support Ukraine in its efforts against Russia? Some of the reasons have already been explained. Japan's relationship with Russia has always featured a certain amount of tension, even during the periods when Japan was trying to extend the diplomatic olive branch. Putin has only added to those tensions by militarizing the northern territories, transforming the islands into very real threats to Japan and its sovereignty, even if we disregard Japan's territorial claims on the islands. Nevertheless, these issues alone wouldn't be enough to explain Japan's slow moving away from attempted diplomacy to full-blown support for Ukraine. There are other factors at play. For instance, Japan is taking a different approach to its foreign policy than it has in many decades. Following World War II, Japan made the purposeful decision to focus on pacifism in its foreign policy. We see that in its dealings with Russia. Until the last 2 years, the nations never came to blows, even with Russia claiming territory that Japan believes rightfully belongs to it. In a piece titled Historical Parameters of Japanese Foreign Policy, Brookings points out that this approach has been extremely lucrative for Japan. The institution of the Bretton Woods system, which required currencies to peg themselves to the US dollar, led to extended periods of economic success. Plus, by taking a more passive role, Brookings claims, Japan has been able to weather various crises, revolutions, and wars seen in the Indo-Pacific and East Asia since World War II, coming out practically undamaged in all cases. However, international circumstances are slowly pushing Japan away from its policies of passiveness and pacifism. The increasing modernization of China since 2000 is one such issue, with Japan likely believing that it's slowly losing its position as one of the chief power brokers in the Indo-Pacific as China's influence grows. That growth in Chinese influence can also explain Japan's approach to Russia. Putin and Xi are clearly allies in many respects. That's evident from the previously mentioned summits. Couple that with Russia's militarization of the northern territories, and Japan now has 2 countries that are subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, threatening its sovereignty. In the face of these issues, Japan has needed to change its national strategy. According to CSIS, this change is actually the result of an evolution that began during the Gulf War in 1991. At that time, Japan heavily relied on the Middle East for its oil imports, though it also contributed $13 billion to support the coalition forces fighting in the Gulf. At the time, Japan's actions were criticized as checkbook diplomacy, with many wondering why the country refused to dedicate any of its own forces to support the coalition soldiers. CSIS notes that the criticism marked a change in how Japan approached the concept of international cooperation. The years that followed saw it forming and expanding partnerships with its allies, in addition to boosting its defense spending. The latter efforts culminated in Japan's cabinet approving a request for the country's largest ever defense package. The package will see Japan invest $55.9 billion into its military in 2024, with the number increasing annually until it reaches a peak of $62.5 billion in 2027. Add Japan's inclusion in a trilateral defense agreement with the US and South Korea into the mix, in addition to strengthening its ties with NATO, India, and Australia, and you have a country that's shifting its foreign policy. Passivity couldn't work in the current global landscape. CSIS notes that these changes in approach appear to be generally supported by the Japanese people. For instance, a survey conducted in March 2022, a month after Russia invaded Ukraine, revealed that 77% of Japan's citizens believe that the international community needed to band together to stop the Russian invasion. If they didn't, the respondents worried, the territorial changes Russia enforced could pave the way for future attempts at change, such as a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Again, it comes back to Japan becoming increasingly concerned about power plays by other nations. Russia taking Ukraine would make China more confident in attempting the same in the Indo-Pacific with Taiwan. So it was crucial for Japan that it became part of the collective effort to prevent Putin's special military operation, as doing so means it could justify being part of future collective efforts to stop Chinese expansion. It's a complete turnaround in policy, and a turnaround that hit hard with Putin, who may have believed that he could have maintained cordial relations with Japan even as he invaded Ukraine. That could have been a possibility were it not for another change happening in Japan. The politicians who had spent so long trying to build a stronger relationship with Russia are gradually aging out. That's according to an October 2023 report by the Carnegie Endowment, which noted that even as Japan expressed its support for Ukraine, various pro-Russia lobbies inside the country were making headlines. These older politicians were claiming NATO's responses to Russia were provocative and that Ukraine had misguided policies. However, these lobbyists have been growing quieter since the 2010s, when pro-Russia policies in Japan were at their peak. The assassination of Shinzo Abe was the trigger for this turnaround. The man who had often referred to Putin as Dear Vladimir was responsible for Japan's failure to sanction Russia during the annexation of Crimea in 2014. He also created plans to strengthen economic cooperation between Japan and Russia in 2016. Even when he stepped down from his role as Prime Minister in 2020, the Carnegie Endowment says his influence within Japan's Liberal Democratic Party would likely have led to more pro-Russian policy. Abe's July 2022 assassination meant Putin lost his biggest Japanese ally. He's also had to watch as other allies such as former Prime Minister Yukio Hatsuyama and Yoshiro Mori have grown too old to have any true influence on Japanese policy. They are now retired. Another pro-Putin influence in Japanese politics, Muneo Suzuki, was the first foreign politician Putin received after he became Russia's president. Suzuki even served as an unofficial advisor in Russia's policies under Abe, showcasing just how strong his ties with Russia became. But Suzuki is now working under a cloud of internal suspicion. His imprisonment for corruption in the 2000s hasn't helped, with every effort he's made to visit Russia since February 2022 being blocked by his own party. There's a new generation of politicians coming to the fore in Japan. And with each loss of the old guard, Putin's influence has waned to the point where it's almost impossible for him to maintain a relationship with Japan. Signing a mutual defense pact with North Korea in June 2024 was essentially Putin putting an end to any chances of rebuilding that relationship. To Japan, that pact will be little more than another sign of aggression to go along with Russia's actions in the Northern Territories and its allegiance with China. After all, North Korea represents another major threat to Japan in the Indo-Pacific, as well as a threat to Japan's South Korean allies. As the Council on Foreign Relations highlights, allying with Russia makes North Korea even more dangerous, adding to Fumio Kishida's claims that Russian aggression in Ukraine can't be seen as a Europe-only problem. All of this brings us back to Japan's decision to send even more financial aid to Ukraine. Putin's responses to this powerful blow indicate just how far Russia's relationship with Japan has fallen. In June 2024, Kyodo News reported on the Russian president's comments that the current conditions between the countries aren't conducive to them coming back to the negotiating table to create a peace treaty for the post-World War II era. Japan would likely agree, though not for the same reasons as Putin expresses. According to Putin, the blame firmly rests with Japan and its support of Ukraine. Everything that's been done has been done by Japan, Putin claimed, seemingly ignorant, likely purposefully, of the fact that Japan's decisions are being informed by his actions and his special military operation. These comments came after the suspension of peace talks with Japan in March 2022. Putin went even further, claiming that he will not shy away from visiting the islands that make up the Northern Territories, essentially telling Japan that he's happy to instigate by reinforcing their status as Russian islands. Reading between the lines, we can see that Japan's deepening support for Ukraine dealt a body blow to Putin. It's no coincidence that he ended the peace treaty talks in March, by which point Japan had already been supporting Ukraine for 2 years. The pledge of a further $12 billion in aid seems to be the straw that finally broke his back, with that money sending a clearer message than ever before that Japan is no longer an ally to Russia. It is an enemy. The status as an enemy leads us to the final question we'll ask in this video. Will Japan's pledges of financial aid ever turn into pledges of military aid? Debates have raged over whether Japan should take the final step in solidifying its support of Ukraine. If it does, the blow would be even more devastating to Putin than the deterioration of relationships he's had to watch over the last 2 years and Japan's financial aid packages combined. Still, Japan remains reluctant to provide weapons, to an extent. In truth, Japan has already found a handful of diplomatic workarounds that allow it to indirectly provide weapons to Ukraine without actually providing them itself. For instance, there appear to be no conditions placed on the billions in financial aid it's provided, meaning Ukraine is likely free to use that money to purchase weapons if it so chooses. If nothing else, that aid is helping to keep Ukraine's economy afloat during a period when it would be at deep risk of collapsing. Again, that can help Ukraine to purchase weapons, as well as enable it to keep its manufacturing base running so it can build weapons of its own. More interestingly, Japan has found several workarounds in the weapons department. For instance, Nikkei Asia reported in July 2024 that Japan had agreed to sell $90 million worth of Patriot missiles to the United States, supposedly to help the US replenish its numbers after it's provided hundreds of these missiles to Ukraine. There are no conditions on how the US uses these missile systems once they land in Washington. It's very possible, perhaps even likely, that the Patriot systems Japan is providing to the US will eventually find their way to Ukraine, with the US essentially acting as an intermediary, so Japan doesn't have to deliver the weapons directly. Russia is aware of this. Its foreign ministry claimed that the appearance of any Japanese missiles in Ukraine would lead to consequences for Russia's relations with Japan. However, given the state of those relations, it's likely that Japan isn't too worried about what those consequences might be. It's also worth noting that Japan has provided protective gear to Ukraine as part of its aid packages. Deliveries of non-lethal equipment, including body armor, helmets, and about 100 non-military vehicles, show that Japan is willing to support Ukraine a little more directly. Still, it draws the line at sending weapons. Some argue that Japan needs to change this policy. For instance, an April 2023 article published by the Japan Times pointed out that Japan was the only member of the G7 that had yet to send weapons directly to Ukraine. However, the same report noted that Japan had made changes to its guidelines, allowing it to make the previously mentioned donations of helmets, body armor, and vehicles. At the time, talks were being arranged to discuss the possibility of making further amendments to those guidelines, which would allow Japan to provide Ukraine with lethal weapons. Those talks didn't lead to a change. However, the same report suggests that there is a growing appetite inside Japan for the country to take a more active stance. Nippon Ishin no Kai, a right-wing populist party in Japan, showcases that appetite. In 2023, the party's upper house secretary general, Naoki Inoue, chose to send 20 pickup trucks, each loaded with canned food and other supplies to Ukraine. He paid for this using a portion of his party members' stipends while sending a message about the delivery. As long as these pickup trucks aren't used to transport machine guns, there should be no problem. It's up to the receiver to use them in that way. As long as we ourselves do not offer the trucks with that intention, we are fine. In other words, it's the same approach Japan potentially might take with the replenishment of Patriot missile systems over a year later. Others argue that Japan may not be delivering weapons directly because it has a deficit at home. One of those people is Atsuko Higashino, who is a professor at the University of Tsukuba studying the Ukraine war. She comes out in favor of Japan delivering Patriot missiles to Ukraine, though she also believes that deliveries are unlikely in the near future because Japan still has a serious deficit when it comes to its defense systems, a deficit that the recent military budget approvals could see it rectify. Perhaps the future will see Japan lending more direct military aid to Ukraine once it believes it's in a position to defend itself against Russia and China in the Indo-Pacific. If nothing else, the $12 billion it pledged in February 2024 will be a serious blow to Putin, both in terms of increased support being lent to Ukraine and the further collapse of Russia's relationship with Japan. Should Japan choose to start sending weapons, that blow will be followed up with a haymaker signaling Japan's intent to truly oppose Russia. And not just in Ukraine, but also in its efforts to expand its influence in the Indo-Pacific, as well as its work to militarize the Northern Territories. But what do you think? Is Japan edging ever closer to a point where it'll start sending weapons to Ukraine, or is it still too stuck in its pacifism policies to do so? How do you think Russia would react if Japan crossed that line and went merely beyond providing financial aid to Ukraine? The prolonged conflict in Ukraine, now stretching well into its third year, has witnessed relentless Ukrainian resilience against formidable odds. While Russian forces have claimed minor territorial gains since the fall of Avdiivka in February, the reality is that these are costly and largely symbolic. Ukraine's strategic countermaneuvers and the staunch defense of key positions like northern Donetsk Oblast and the areas surrounding Bakhmut and Vuhledar in Zaporizhia Oblast underscore a narrative not just of survival, but of calculated resistance. This strategic endurance is all the more remarkable given Ukraine's current artillery challenges. Dubbed shell hunger, this shortfall has seen daily artillery discharges dwindle from 10,000 shells to roughly 2,000. This, coupled with damage to many Ukrainian howitzers due to precise Russian counter-battery efforts and new drone tactics, has undeniably strained Ukraine's defensive capabilities. Yet despite these setbacks, the spirit of Ukrainian forces remains unbroken. In contrast to the narrative of Russian advancement, the reality of the battlefield tells a different story. Russian forces, despite an extensive artillery arsenal and support from rogue states like North Korea, are achieving only marginal gains at an unsustainable cost. Their reliance on volume over tactical efficiency has not translated into decisive success, highlighting the inefficiencies and desperation underlying their military strategy. Amid these challenging dynamics, a beacon of support shines from Denmark. This Scandinavian ally has stepped up, ready to alter the course of events with significant artillery contributions. This move is not just a military aid package, it's a symbol of a shifting European foreign policy landscape that increasingly seeks to support Ukraine's staunch defense efforts. But how transformative could Denmark's involvement be, and what does this mean for the balance of power on the front lines? As Ukraine's defense minister Rustem Umerov advocates for more Western artillery and ammunition, Denmark's commitment could very well be a game-changer. Providing the much-needed artillery might not only alleviate Ukraine's shell hunger, but could also empower Ukrainian forces to reclaim momentum. This support from Denmark and other Western nations underscores a collective international commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and resilience, setting the stage for a pivotal shift in the ongoing conflict. But how exactly is Denmark stepping up in this crucial hour? Before we explore their pivotal contributions, let's rewind to the events that set this commitment in motion. Just 2 days after the fall of Avdiivka, a bold announcement came from the north. Denmark pledged to donate all of its existing artillery units to Ukraine. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen broke sharply with Europe's cautious stance on arms support, criticizing the continent's hesitancy and highlighting the available resources. This is not only a question about production, because we have weapons, we have ammunition, we have air defenses that we don't have to use ourselves at the moment, that we should deliver to Ukraine. With this declaration, Denmark not only promised critical military support, but also challenged other nations to reassess their positions. You see, to prove the point that such a donation would not be crippling to its arsenal, Denmark's Ministry of Defense said it was in the process of acquiring new military capabilities on a rapid basis to make up for the loss of units. In Munich, Frederiksen also stressed the importance of not waiting for a politically divided United States to take the lead on supplying the Ukrainians. It doesn't matter what the US comes up with. We Europeans have to defend ourselves. This is a war on the European continent. Frederiksen's remarks were the latest example of Denmark's evolving geopolitical strategy, and it's helpful to see Copenhagen's artillery donation in that light. Although Denmark was one of the founding members of the NATO alliance in 1949 and played a pivotal geostrategic role thanks to its control of the Baltic's western choke points, its overall level of security integration with the rest of Europe was not as well advanced. Until June 2022, Denmark was the only one of the European nation's 27 member states which did not participate in the latter's common security policy. Denmark did not take part in the EU defense discussions, nor get involved with the joint military missions. These opt-outs originated with Denmark's initial rejection of the Maastricht Treaty in a 1992 referendum. To secure Denmark's accession to the European Union, Copenhagen was granted a number of exceptions to the Maastricht Treaty through the Edinburgh Agreement. One of these involved defense issues. With these opt-outs in place, Danish voters agreed to join the EU on such terms in a second referendum the following year. This security opt-out policy was in tradition with Denmark's Cold War footing. Although it was a member of NATO, Denmark did not allow any foreign forces on its soil under the alliance's auspices. The Soviet Union was the dominant power in the Baltic and had troops in nearby Germany, troops which outnumbered the West's. Denmark wanted to place itself under America's nuclear umbrella, but did not otherwise want to risk upsetting the Soviet Union. Recent historical experience reminded Danish policymakers of the importance of this goal. British forces only barely prevented the Red Army from pushing onto Denmark when they captured the city of Lübeck in northern Germany on May 2, 1945, only hours before Soviet troops came into the area. The Soviet Union had also occupied the Danish island of Bornholm, which sits on strategic territory in the Baltic since the previous year. Bornholm is an island roughly in the middle of the strait between Sweden's southern coast and Poland's northern one. A military presence there can cut off movement between east and west in the Baltic. Fortunately for the Danes on Bornholm, Stalin agreed to withdraw the Red Army from the island and did so in April 1946, thus making it a rare example of the Iron Curtain receding in the immediate post-World War II era. However, Stalin's move only came with the understanding that Denmark would not host foreign troops on its soil, even though it was in the West's sphere of influence. American and British policymakers quietly agreed about this, and the unspoken agreement held throughout the Cold War. After the Cold War ended, Denmark slackened on its defense spending. It last spent 2% of its GDP on defense in 1989 and fell to a low of 1.1% in 2015. But that's now starting to change too, as it further integrated itself with European and NATO security networks and gradually ended the policy of quasi-neutrality. Denmark also pledged that it would increase its defense spending and hit the 2% mark by 2033, although there will undoubtedly be many voices in the West that say this rate of increase is too slow. Either way, recent moves in Denmark suggest that its long period of relative military neutrality is coming to an end, and this policy shift has been sanctioned by Danish voters. On June 1, 2022, Denmark held a referendum that asked a simple question. Do you vote yes or no on Denmark being able to participate in the European defense and security cooperation by abolishing the EU defense opt-out? Amidst Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Danish voters chose yes by a margin of nearly 67 to 32%. The vote therefore ended Copenhagen's comparative military isolation from the rest of Europe. The result meant that Danish troops could participate in joint military operations under the EU's banner and have more of an influence in joint European defense policy. More importantly, the result of the referendum made it far easier for the Danish military to acquire weapons and equipment, which is one of the reasons why Copenhagen understands that it can donate all of its artillery to Ukraine. Russia reacted negatively to the news and stopped supplying natural gas to one of Denmark's power companies. Although this did not significantly affect Denmark's energy supply, the move was another demonstration of Russia's willingness to use coercive methods as a means of statecraft. These maneuvers on the part of Moscow likely only further convinced Danish voters that they had made the right decision. Even before the invasion, Denmark was signaling the beginning of its seismic shift in security policy. As Russia was gathering its forces along the Ukrainian border and an invasion seemed imminent, PM Frederiksen suggested that negotiations were ongoing with the United States on a new bilateral defense agreement that could station American troops and military equipment on Danish soil for the first time. Danish Defense Minister Morten Bødskov said any new agreement would be designed to give American forces better access to Europe. The agreement would also likely allow for more cross-training between American and Danish troops, and perhaps more importantly, could make acquiring new military equipment and ammunition easier for the Danes. Once it joined the broader European defense community, Denmark demonstrated its disproportionate willingness to supply Ukraine. It's one of the major donors of F-16 fighter jets, supplying the Ukrainians with 19 of them, which should be sent out by 2025. This is the broader context behind Denmark's more recent decision to donate all of its artillery to Ukraine. Copenhagen's donation of artillery amounts to a small sum, as it has no MLRS units or towed artillery. Rather, the GFI lists Denmark as having 19 self-propelled artillery units, with 15 of them being in a state of readiness. These units are the French-made Caesar self-propelled howitzer. The Caesar entered service in 2008 and has an operational range of about 600 kilometers, with a crew between 3 and 5 operators. Each unit has a typical magazine of 36 shells. The Caesar fires NATO standard 155mm ammunition, up to a range of 34 kilometers and up to 42 kilometers when using an extended range full-bore shell, ERFB. These rounds were originally designed by the Canadian artillery engineer Gerard Bull, who became famous for working on the concept of Saddam Hussein's Project Babylon superguns, Big Babylon and Baby Babylon. Bull was assassinated in 1990, possibly by Israeli agents who did not want to see the Iraqis' superguns become a reality. Unlike standard rounds, these shells are longer and thinner. ERFB rounds have peculiar nubs around their midsections, which help to engage the rifling in the gun and stabilize the projectile in flight, although later ERFB rounds may not have these. ERFB rounds have significantly increased range compared to a standard shell, but at the cost of reduced accuracy. The decreased accuracy has meant that the ERFB round has not become a NATO standard, but the Caesar is nevertheless capable of firing it. The Caesar can increase its range even further, up to a range of 52 kilometers, when it uses rocket-assisted shells. Each Caesar costs about $7.5 million per unit, but the pricing depends on individual contracts. As an example, the acquisition of 52 Caesar howitzers was approved by the Czech Ministry of Defense on September 1, 2021, and the value of that contract is around $288 million. The Caesar has to this point performed well in the war. Correlation does not necessarily equal causation, but it may be more than coincidental that after Ukraine started to receive its Caesar guns, Russian artillery units began to suffer heavy losses. Its introduction, therefore, seems to have coincided with better Ukrainian counter-battery fire. At the height of the Ukrainian gunners' effectiveness, the Russians were supposedly losing between 20 and 40 artillery systems per day. Unfortunately for the Ukrainians, the Caesar was not enough to turn the tide, as the Russians dug in with the benefit of the most elaborate network of fortifications seen in Europe since the First World War. Ukraine's Zaporizhia campaign failed to reach even its first objective, the road junction at Tokmak. As of April 2024, the Oryx blog lists a visually confirmed 8 losses of Caesar units. 5 have been destroyed and 3 damaged. Denmark's donation of its 19 Caesars comes amid new French donations of the unit. Sensing the desperate shortage of artillery for the Ukrainians, France announced in January that it intended to deliver an additional 78 Caesar units to Ukraine and sought €280 million to assist with 60 of these. While Denmark was already sending all of its Caesar artillery units to Ukraine by April 2023, Fredriksson's remarks in Munich were an announcement that it would be sending a different system there too. In addition to the Caesar units, Denmark has 21 X-21 Cardon mortars, which will now be on their way to Ukraine. The Cardon was originally created in Israel and can be chambered to fire 81 or 120mm shells. The 120mm Cordon is muzzle-loaded, but despite this, the mortar has a burst rate of 16 rounds per minute and a sustained rate of fire of around 4 rounds per minute. The Cardon operates on an autonomous recoil system and is controlled by computers, although it can be laid and targeted manually with its backup handles and optical sights if the computerized fire control is compromised. The Cardon has an effective range of about 7.2 kilometers. To improve accuracy, the Danes decided to equip their Cardon mortars with MVRS 700SC muzzle velocity radar systems manufactured by their domestic Weibel company. This system takes account of atmospheric conditions like temperature and humidity, which influence the conditions in the barrel and therefore the muzzle velocity of the mortar's round, which in turn influences the accuracy of its fire. The MVRS 700SC's presence allows the Danish Cardon systems to compensate for environmental conditions and improve their accuracy. This radar system is integrated with the Cardon's computerized fire control system through an antenna and a processor. The Danes received the Cardon in 2019 and specifically sought to use it as mobile firepower. Following Russia's original intervention in Ukraine in 2014, one of the lessons Denmark took away was the vulnerability of artillery to counter battery fire thanks to radar and drone detection. To adapt to this reality, the Danes decided to integrate the Israeli Cardon mortar with their new Piranha 5 armored personnel carrier. The integration better allows the Cardon to deliver fire support and then move away before the enemy can spot it and retaliate. Denmark's decision to send its entire artillery force to Ukraine is the latest sign of a gradually changing philosophy among the Western powers. As the war commenced, Western nations were cautious about escalating the conflict, hesitating to supply Ukraine with high-impact weaponry such as long-range ballistic and cruise missiles. This cautious stance began to shift dramatically in 2023, marked by significant support, including main battle tanks, cluster bombs, Storm Shadow cruise missiles, and the pivotal American ATACMS for Ukraine's HIMARS units. Despite these substantial commitments, which initially raised concerns about escalation, the successful utilization of these systems by Ukraine in 2022 helped to alleviate fears, shifting the focus toward the potential depletion of Western arsenals. Years of peace, along with a focus on counter-terrorism, had not prepared the West for the intense demands of modern, high-intensity warfare, where sophisticated ammunition is consumed at an alarming rate. This concern is compounded by the complexity and vulnerability of the supply chains needed to produce and distribute modern precision munitions. Yet the Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen argued that supporting Ukraine, even at the expense of Western stockpiles, was a strategic necessity. In her view, a Russian defeat in Ukraine would ultimately enhance Western security more reliably than maintaining large arsenals at home. While Denmark's contribution of artillery might not decisively tip the scales of the war, Frederiksen hoped her bold move would catalyze broader European support, encouraging a more substantial collective effort. This hope seemed to be materializing when, at a Munich conference, Czech defense official Jan Jiras revealed that 800,000 artillery shells could be procured from non-Western stockpiles for Ukraine at a cost of $1.5 billion, proposing a feasible solution to swiftly bolster Ukraine's artillery capabilities. His announcement underscored a growing willingness among European nations to find innovative ways to support Ukraine's defense and maintain the momentum in its counteroffensive efforts. On March 8th, Czech President Petr Pavel announced that a group of 18 countries had funded the purchase of all of those shells in full. Germany alone would buy 180,000 rounds with a price tag of $618 million, which amounted to 40% of the total. Denmark also participated in the financing alongside Belgium, the Netherlands, and Canada. The effort that Denmark contributed to resulted in the procurement of about 400,000 of the shells. At about the same time, the Czechs identified a further 700,000 idle artillery shells that could be purchased for $1.8 billion. Ukraine's Western allies, including Denmark, have agreed to purchase these also. Thanks to Europe's collective efforts, Ukraine's artillery and shell shortage looks like it will end by this summer. When the Czech-brokered ammunition begins to arrive, the expected date of delivery is June. As the summer matures, Ukraine might begin to fire around 6,000 shells per day, 3 times as many as now. The number might grow further to 10,000 per day, now that the divided United States Congress has decided to deliver additional aid. Ukraine's shell hunger is about to end. And the way in which it will come to an end is an item of evidence in favor of PM Frederiksen's notion of the need for Europe to take the lead in its own defense. For her, defeating Russia in Ukraine now, even if it means a depletion of valuable military stockpiles at home, is a preferable option to using those weapons in a future on one's own doorstep in another, worse conflict down the line. But will the rest of Europe follow suit? Do you agree with PM Frederiksen? Should Western countries send much more of their available arsenals to Ukraine? Is this the best way for Europe to secure itself from future Russian aggression? Ukraine has permission to strike Russian targets inside Russian territory, meaning the world may be inching ever closer to World War III. At least, that's the impression that David Cameron, the UK's Foreign Secretary, gave with recent comments that appeared to give the green light to Ukraine. The Kremlin didn't react well. It believes that using Western weapons to strike targets inside Russia is an escalation of the war it started. And with that escalation, potential repercussions that could see Britain, along with several other NATO-aligned countries, dragged directly into the conflict. The question now is simple. What happens next? Will Ukraine actually start striking Russian targets inside Russia itself? Has it started doing so already, and if so, are Russia's claims of an escalation justified? Before we answer those questions, let's examine the comments that have led us to this situation. On May 3, 2024, David Cameron pledged to provide Ukraine with £3 billion of military aid, approximately $3.84 billion, per year, as long as it takes for that aid to help Ukraine win the war against Russia. That alone would have come as a blow to the Kremlin. Not only would Ukraine receive more help from the UK, which hasn't been shy about supporting the country since the beginning of the war, but the comments represent a long-term commitment. That $3.84 billion will come every year, with no political wrangling required to get it approved. But these weren't the comments that so infuriated the Kremlin. In addition to pledging the money, Cameron also said, just as Russia is striking inside Ukraine, you can quite understand why Ukraine feels the need to make sure it's defending itself. A somewhat ambiguous statement. Failing to look at the subtext here could even lead somebody to believe that Cameron is simply restating that Ukraine has the right to defend itself on its own territory, but that's not what he's saying. Prior to making this statement, the UK has generally made it clear that any of the weapons it provides should only be used on Ukrainian sovereign territory. That includes the Storm Shadow missile, which can travel for around 248 miles. Ukraine has used that missile to conduct several strikes in Russian-controlled Crimea, which fits the UK's description of sovereign territory. That much was made clear in February 2024, when the country's government released a statement on the 10th anniversary of Crimea's annexation. We want to be clear that the UK will never recognize Russia's illegal claims to the region or to any Ukrainian territory, and that we will continue to do all we can to stop Putin's war machine and support Ukraine in their fight for as long as it takes. So Ukraine already had the green light to use British missiles in Crimea, but now it appears to have the green light to use them in Russia itself. Pay special attention to the "just as Russia is striking inside Ukraine" portion of Cameron's comments. They suggest that Britain is fine with Ukraine taking an eye for an eye approach with Russia. Just as Russia strikes in Ukraine, so can Ukraine strike in Russia. Cameron even made that aspect clear later when he said that Ukraine absolutely has the right to strike back at Russia. Britain isn't the only country that has permitted Ukraine to use the weapons it supplies on Russian territory. Politico reports that most countries providing aid to Ukraine since the war began have done so under the condition that Ukraine doesn't use any of the weapons they supply to attack Russia itself. That's changing. Both Latvia and Finland, countries that likely see themselves as potential targets for Russia if it succeeds in taking Ukraine, have since made similar comments to Cameron's. Ukraine has the right to use any weapons they supply to defend itself, which includes direct strikes inside Russia. Moscow's response was outraged. Dmitry Peskov, a spokesman for the Kremlin, called Cameron's comments another very dangerous statement, before going on to claim that they represented a direct escalation of the tension around the Ukrainian conflict. Chillingly, he added that such comments could pose a larger threat to European security if they weren't backpedaled. Cameron has taken nothing back. If anything, his comments appear to have emboldened others. On May 24, 2024, NATO's Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg took part in an interview with The Economist. Stoltenberg, who is coming to the end of his 10-year stint in the role, used the interview to claim that the time has come for Ukraine's allies to consider whether they should lift some of the restrictions they've placed on how Ukraine uses the weapons they supply. Some already have, as we've seen with Britain, Latvia, and Finland. However, The Economist believes that Stoltenberg's comments may have been targeted toward the United States. It says his claims had a clear, if unnamed, target, with the US lifting its own restrictions potentially being a key factor in Ukraine's ability to defend itself against Russia. It gets worse for Vladimir Putin. A Sky News report from May 28th looked at the comments made by Poland's foreign minister, Radosław Sikorski, who believes that the country shouldn't rule out sending its troops into Ukraine. Those comments echo French President Emmanuel Macron's words in February. "We shouldn't rule it out. We should leave Putin guessing as to our intentions." Putin is watching his war with Ukraine slowly shift. In the past, he's been able to launch operations in Ukraine with no direct threat being posed to Russia, even though he understood that Ukraine was receiving weapons from overseas and those weapons were being used to kill Russian troops inside Ukraine. He knew that Russia itself was safe. Ukraine could only use those weapons to defend itself on its own territory. Now he's not so certain. He has several countries, France and Poland included, claiming that direct intervention inside Ukraine is a possibility. And with Britain, France, and Latvia all approving the use of their weapons in Russia, as well as NATO's Secretary-General placing pressure on the United States, it may only be a matter of time before Ukraine starts to target military installations in Russia itself. Putin's response shows just how much these recent developments concern him. Outside of using a Kremlin spokesperson to talk about how Britain's green light represents an unnecessary escalation of tensions within Europe, he has also directly threatened the United Kingdom. On May 6th, Reuters reported that Russia summoned the country's British ambassador, Nigel Casey, to its foreign ministry to lodge a formal complaint against Cameron's comments. For its part, Britain denied that Casey was summoned, instead saying he'd arrived for a diplomatic and pre-arranged meeting in which he would reinforce the UK's support for Ukraine. Russia still decided to use that meeting to make threats. The Foreign Ministry supposedly warned Casey that the use of any British weapons on Russian territory, even by Ukraine, would make Britain a de facto part of the conflict. And with that role comes the possibility that British military facilities, both in Ukraine and elsewhere, could be targeted. In case there was any doubt left, the Foreign Ministry went on to say the ambassador was called upon to reflect on the inevitable catastrophic consequences of such hostile steps by London and immediately refute the belligerent provocative statements of the head of the Foreign Office in the most decisive and unambiguous way. It's unlikely that Russia got what it wanted out of Casey. But it had delivered its message: allow Ukraine to use your weapons in Russia, and Russia will respond. If the threat wasn't clear enough from the Foreign Ministry's statement, it was made crystal clear when Putin ordered his military to hold battlefield nuclear weapons drills. That exercise began on May 21st, with Reuters reporting that Russian vehicles had started to gather in Russia's southern military district for the first phase of the drill. The district lies adjacent to Ukraine, with Russia apparently running exercises for the launch of tactical nuclear warheads. To make its point even clearer, Moscow has also involved Belarus in the drills, which is a Russian ally and a country that shares a border with Ukraine. Russia's foreign ministry even provided details about the drills Moscow ran. It said Russian troops were practicing obtaining what it calls special ammunition, essentially code for nuclear warheads, for Russia's Iskander missiles. They were also practicing equipping potential launch vehicles with those missiles, as well as covertly moving them to designated launch positions, presumably so they could be used to strike Ukraine. Aviation units also took part in the drill, with crews practicing how to fit nuclear warheads to Kinzhal hypersonic missiles before they fly into designated patrol areas. Again, a term that seemed like code for potential launching points. These weren't pre-planned drills. Russia's foreign ministry made that clear when it claimed that they should send a sobering signal to the West, specifically the United Kingdom, as well as what it sees as the puppets that the West controls in Ukraine. It added, "We hope these drills will cool the hotheads in Western capitals, while helping the countries that have provided the green light to Ukraine to realize the potential catastrophic consequences of the strategic risks they're generating." There's the word again, catastrophic. As devastating to Putin as Ukraine getting the okay to use British weapons on Russian soil may be, he's using it as an opportunity to showcase Moscow's power. These drills are a stark reminder to the UK, as well as Ukraine, that Russia has tactical nuclear warheads. They're also a reminder that its troops know how to launch those warheads and that Russia is a far stronger nuclear power than Britain. You could also consider the drills a veiled warning to the United States. Don't bow to NATO pressure, Putin may be telling the US. If you do, we may be forced to turn the Ukraine war into a nuclear conflict that will involve the US if you grant permission to use your weapons on Russian territory. The thing is, you could argue that Ukraine is already using Western weapons to strike Russia on Russian territory. Take Ukraine's attacks on Russian oil refineries as an example. Global Witness points out those attacks started in 2024, essentially allowing Ukraine to create a new front in the war. But it's also here where Ukraine starts to see pushback from its military allies. Though Ukraine considers those refineries to be legitimate military targets, not least because they're believed to supply Russia's military with fuel, the United States has urged Ukraine to halt the attacks. Not because the US is worried about the attacks angering Russia. Rather, the US doesn't want Russian oil refineries going offline to affect global oil prices. Global Witness claims that President Joe Biden is so set on keeping US oil prices stable during the November 2024 election campaign that he wants Ukraine to hold off on these attacks until after that campaign ends. America's Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin outlined this thought process in April 2024, claiming that any Ukrainian attacks on Russian oil refineries would have a knock-on effect in terms of the global energy situation. His recommendation was that Ukraine focus attacks on tactical and operational targets, with Ukraine likely believing that those refineries fall into both categories, seeing as they're thought to be supplying Russian troops with fuel. Those attacks have also been effective. Ukraine struck two facilities during the first few months of 2024, Lukoil's Volgograd and Norsy factories. The latter is especially important. It provides about 11% of Russia's gasoline requirements, with Ukraine's drone strikes dropping its output by half. Attacks on the Volgograd factory resulted in fires breaking out, allowing Ukraine to claim a small victory against the largest petroleum products creating factory in Russia's southern border region. Worse yet for the US argument, court documents obtained by Global Witness show that both factories have signed contracts to supply the Russian military. Volgograd has a contract with Russia's Ministry of Defense dating back to 2018 to supply Moscow's military with oil products. The Norsy factory has a similar contract, in addition to one signed in 2020 that sees it providing jet fuel to the Federal Security Service. These are far from the only Ukrainian attacks on oil refineries within Russia. It's launched 12 in 2024 alone, flying in the face of America's politicized argument about avoiding such attacks because of their impact on oil prices. Still, the US response showcases how some Western nations have approached the concept of Ukraine attacking Russia on its own soil. Other attacks against Russia using Western weaponry are a little more complicated. For instance, does it count as an attack on Russian soil if Ukraine is attacking targets on the Russian side of the front line it shares with its enemy? Putin may think so. He regards all of Ukraine as Russian territory. Plus, his current desire for a ceasefire is on the condition that Russia essentially claims all of the territory it's captured from Ukraine thus far during the war. Following that logic, Ukraine's May 2024 attack on a Russian base in Luhansk could be considered a strike using Western weapons in Russian territory. The Sun reports that aerial images show Ukraine unleashing MGM-140 ATACMS missiles on Russian troops in a captured region of Luhansk. These missiles are devastating. Capable of reaching a top speed of 2,300 miles per hour, they have a range of around 186 miles and can carry a 500-pound warhead. But most notably, the missile essentially releases small bomblets upon detonating, allowing Ukraine to carpet a large area with explosions rather than unleashing a precise missile strike. Ukraine used that feature to its advantage in the Luhansk strike. Aerial footage analyzed by the Institute for the Study of War seems to show that the strikes targeted a Russian training ground, killing 116 troops. Another strike destroyed a launcher and charger in Russian-controlled territory, which Ukraine attacked with 6 of these missiles. There are also Ukraine's attacks on Sevastopol to consider. One of the most recent, a missile strike that struck 2 Russian landing ships and damaged infrastructure at the port in March 2024, demonstrates the level of attack Ukraine is willing to levy at Sevastopol. And again, we may see a territorial wrinkle at play here. Sevastopol is located in Crimea, which Russia annexed from Ukraine in 2014. To Putin, that means it's Russian territory, and any attack using Western weapons could constitute an attack on Russia itself. But to Ukraine, Sevastopol and the entire Crimea belong to Kyiv, with any attacks launched there simply being attempts to retake territory that it believes rightfully belongs to it. The point here is that it's easy to argue that Ukraine is already striking within Russian territory. That's certainly what it's doing with the oil refineries, though it's not confirmed if it's used Western weapons to make those strikes. It absolutely used American missiles in its attacks in Luhansk, if that strike was conducted on territory that Russia had taken during the war. The same goes for the attacks in Sevastopol. Russia claims ownership of the Crimea region, so Ukraine's strikes against Russia's navy there and in the Black Sea could be considered attacks in Russia. Yet Russia has only now started to warn of catastrophic consequences. Is that a response to the UK and other countries giving their tacit approval for Ukraine to attack Russia more directly? Or are the threats another case of Russian bluster that Putin is unlikely to follow through with? That question remains to be answered in the coming months. What can't be argued is that Russia's outrage at what it deems an escalation of the Ukraine war smacks of hypocrisy. Obviously, Russia started the war, meaning it's directly responsible for the escalation of tensions both with Ukraine and Europe at large. But that's not where the hypocrisy ends. Russia has also been more than willing to use weapons supplied by other countries on Ukrainian territory. Take its receipt of hundreds of Iranian-made drones in mid-2023 as an example. A Reuters report from June of that year says the US believes Russia has deepened its military cooperation with Iran by purchasing several hundred one-way attack drones to use in Ukraine. White House spokesperson John Kirby released a statement claiming that Russia has been using Iranian UAVs to strike Kyiv and terrorize the Ukrainian population. He concluded by pointing out that Russia and Iran's military partnership is deepening. The interesting twist here is that Iran acknowledges that it sent drones to Russia. However, it claims that any drones sent arrived in Moscow before the Ukraine war began. Russia also says that it hasn't used any Iranian drones during the conflict, and yet the US says both are lying. It claims Iranian drones have been flowing into Russia since at least August 2022, and the two countries are cooperating so deeply that Russia is building a special plant in its Alabuga Special Economic Zone to build more of the drones. This is all being done despite Western sanctions that are supposed to prevent Iran from supplying Russia. Russia using Iranian drones throws David Cameron's comments into a new light. Given Britain's close military ties with the United States, as well as the fact that these claims are publicly available, he likely knows that Iran is supplying Russia with weapons. He also knows those weapons are being used in Ukraine. That leads to the obvious argument: what's good for the goose is good for the gander. In other words, if Russia is attacking Ukraine with weapons it has sourced from international partners, there's no reason why Ukraine shouldn't be able to do the same. And Iran isn't the only country that's providing Russia with weapons. In February 2024, Al Jazeera reported that Russia and North Korea appear to have worked out a trade agreement. In return for food, North Korea has sent artillery shells, a staggering 3 million of them since September 2023. The report quotes South Korea's defense minister, Shin Won-sik, who says his country's intelligence teams have tracked the transfer of around 6,700 containers believed to collectively carry either millions of 152mm artillery shells or around 500,000 122mm rounds. Talking to the Yonhap news outlet, he says it could possibly be a mix of the two, and you can say that at least several million shells have been sent. In return, Russia has not only been sending food to North Korea, but has also provided it with raw materials it can use when building other weapons. But just as it did with the reports of buying Iranian drones, Russia denies that it's receiving artillery shells from North Korea. Ukraine disputes that. A May 2024 BBC report suggests that Ukraine's military believes that not only is North Korea supplying Russia with artillery shells, but it's also delivering missiles. And those missiles have been fired in the dozens, injuring more than 70 people and killing at least 24. Russian hypocrisy rears its head again, and the list goes on. In April 2023, Reuters reported on Ukrainian claims that the country's military is increasingly finding Chinese components in weapons Russia is using in the country. Speaking in a video call, Vladislav Vlasiuk, who is an advisor for Ukraine's chief of staff, said, "The trend is now that there are less Western-made components but more, not hard to guess which country, made components. Of course, China." Such components were found in all and aerial drones, apparently used to replace the Swiss-made navigation systems those drones use, as well as in the fire control systems used in Russian tanks. The situation with China is a little different from that with Iran and North Korea. China has consistently denied providing weapons to Russia, a claim that appears to be backed by US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. Speaking to the BBC in April 2024, he said, "What's not happening is the provision of actual arms by China to Russia for use in Ukraine. Instead, China has been much more subtle," Blinken says, by providing critical components Russia can use to build up its war machine. He added that around 90% of the microelectronics Russia imports and likely uses in the war come from China, as do 70% of the machine tools used in its factories, just as Ukraine claimed in 2023. The threat of sanctions placed against China is designed to slow down this trade. But the point, as is the case with Iran and North Korea, remains. Russia is getting help from overseas powers to attack Ukraine. In essence, Russia already appears to be doing precisely what it's telling Ukraine it can't do, using weapons supplied by other countries to attack another country's territory. For Ukraine, this simply means that using its Western-made weapons to strike Russia would be leveling the playing field, all of which brings us to a final question. Now that Ukraine essentially has permission to use British weapons in Russia, will it actually do so? The odds are high that it will. After all, Zelensky has renewed his calls for Ukraine's Western allies to allow the use of their weapons in Russia, most recently during a joint press conference he held with Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez on May 27th. "We need to intensify our joint work with our partners to achieve more. Security and tangible coercion of Russia to peace by all means," he said before adding, "Even those partners who are afraid to give this or that advice should understand that air defense is defense, not attack." In other words, Ukraine wants to use the F-16s and missiles it's receiving from its Western partners to retaliate against the 3,000 Russian aerial bombs flying into Ukraine from Russian territory. Jens Stoltenberg also renewed his calls for Ukraine's NATO allies to allow the use of their weapons on Russian territory. He reinforced what Zelensky said, pointing out that Russian forces are attacking from their own territory behind the front line. Much of that front line, he says, essentially runs along the border between Ukraine and Russia. If you cannot attack Russian forces on the other side of the front line because they are on the other side of the border, then of course, you really reduce the ability of the Ukrainian forces to defend themselves. That comment may offer some insight into the nature of the strikes Ukraine wants to use on Russia. It's not looking to fire missiles at Moscow. Instead, Ukraine simply wants the opportunity to attack Russian positions supporting troops on the front line, even if those positions are within Russian territory. The UK has granted permission for it to do so. Will the United States follow? Let us know what you think, and tell us what impact Ukraine having permission to launch attacks within Russian territory, at least from a handful of its partners, will have on the war.